For 10 years, Marlene Doyle never once let a silent old man in the back booth of the Whistle Stop Diner go hungry, and she never let him pay for a single meal either, though he never once asked her not to charge him. That part matters, and she would want you to understand it right from the start, because this is not a story about a man who begged for kindness and got it. It is a story about a man who asked for absolutely nothing, who barely spoke at all, who sat alone in booth 9 at the back of a diner on Route 68 in Hollow Creek, Kentucky, 3 afternoons a week for a decade, and a cook who decided on her own, with no instructions from anybody and no expectation of anything in return, that he was going to eat a hot meal whether he had a dime in his pocket or not. She didn't know his last name for the first 4 years. She didn't know what he used to do for a living, or why his eyes went somewhere far away every time the diner's old radio played a certain kind of big band trumpet, or why he always left a folded paper napkin squared up perfectly at the edge of the table like he was still, after everything, a man who believed in leaving things orderly. All she knew was that he came in quiet, ate slow, said maybe 6 words the whole meal, and left the way he came, and that some instinct in her, older than any kindness she could explain, told her the check for that table was never, ever going to reach him. 10 years. Somewhere over 1,000 bowls of vegetable soup and a small mountain of cornbread. She never told the owner what she was doing with her own wages to cover it. She never made a show of it in front of the other regulars. She certainly never imagined that the silent man in the gray canvas jacket in booth 9 had once employed nearly half of the adults in her town, that his name was on a rusted water tower 3 miles from where she was standing, or that the decision she made every single week without a second thought was about to matter more than she could have possibly understood. Her name was Marlene Ann Doyle, and on the July morning this story really begins, she was 44 years old and had been the head cook at the Whistle Stop Diner for 16 years, ever since she was a 28-year-old wife and mother learning to run a stove before she'd fully learned to drive. Hollow Creek, Kentucky, sat in the kind of valley that mapmakers technically included, but mattered to almost nobody outside a 40-mile radius. A town of just under 3,000 people, built along a bend in the Licking River, with one blinking traffic light, a Baptist church older than the state highway that ran past it, and a diner that had been serving breakfast since Eisenhower was president. The Whistle Stop wasn't much to look at from the outside, a squat brick building with a faded red awning and a hand-painted sign that had been touched up so many times over the decades that the letters had drifted slightly out of alignment, but inside it smelled like coffee and bacon grease and cornbread, and it had exactly the kind of worn, comfortable, familiar feeling that made grown men who'd moved away to Cincinnati or Louisville drive 2 hours back on a Sunday just to sit in a booth and remember who they used to be. Marlene ran the kitchen with the kind of quiet, absolute authority that made even the diner's cranky ancient owner, a man named Gus Peavy, who was 71 years old and had owned the place since before Marlene was born, mostly just stay out of her way and let her cook. She had grown up 2 counties over, the daughter of a coal truck driver and a woman who cleaned the Baptist church 3 mornings a week for a little extra grocery money. And if there was one thing that upbringing had carved into her before she was old enough to understand why, it was that the difference between a hard week and a bearable one had almost nothing to do with how much anybody had in the bank, and almost everything to do with who noticed you were struggling and did something about it without making you feel small for needing it. Her mother used to send foil-wrapped plates of whatever was left over home with a neighbor whose husband had been laid off from the tire plant, and when young Marlene once asked why they were giving food away when they didn't have much themselves, her mother had said, without even looking up from the dish she was drying, "We always have enough to notice somebody else doesn't." Marlene had carried that sentence around in her chest for 36 years, like a smooth stone in her pocket, and on the day this story starts, she still didn't fully understand how much weight that one habit, learned before she could read, was about to put behind it. She married young, at 22, to a man named Cole Doyle, who fixed cars at the garage off Route 68 and had a laugh that filled up a room and hands that were always faintly stained with engine grease, no matter how hard he scrubbed them on a Friday night. They had 2 children, Abby, who was 13 that July, and already sharper-tongued and more observant than either of her parents entirely liked. And Sam, who was 9 and collected bottle caps in a coffee can and asked questions about everything with the relentless, exhausting curiosity of a boy who had not yet learned that some questions don't have satisfying answers. They lived in a small 3-bedroom house on Birch Hollow Road that Cole's father had built with his own hands in the 60s. And money was never easy, not exactly tight in a way that kept them up at night, but tight in the ordinary, grinding way that meant a car repair or a dentist bill could rearrange a month's plans without much warning. Marlene's wage at the whistle stop was decent for the area, but not generous, and she picked up extra shifts baking pies for the church bake sale and the county fair every fall to make the difference. And none of that, she would tell you later, felt like sacrifice at the time. It just felt like Tuesday. The man in booth 9 had been coming into the whistle stop for exactly 10 years by the July morning this story turns, though nobody, including Marlene, could have told you the precise date he first walked in, because his arrival had never announced itself as anything worth remembering. He came in on a rain-soaked Thursday afternoon a decade earlier, in a gray canvas work jacket gone soft and thin at the elbows, a plain gray cap pulled low, work boots that had clearly walked a great many miles, and he had folded himself into the last booth at the very back of the diner, the one under the flickering ceiling light that Gus never quite got around to fixing, the one nobody else wanted because it was drafty in winter and too warm in summer and a little too far from the kitchen for the waitresses to love serving. He ordered the vegetable soup and a side of cornbread, ate slowly and methodically like a man pacing himself against something, left exactly 40% of the bread, untouched, wrapped carefully in his napkin, said thank you to Marlene when she refilled his water, and left without leaving a name. He came back the following week, and the week after that. Within 2 months, he had a rhythm, 3 afternoons out of 7, usually Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, always between 2 and 4 in the afternoon when the lunch rush had cleared out and the diner had gone quiet and golden with early afternoon light through the front windows. Always booth 9, always the vegetable soup and cornbread, always alone. He rarely spoke beyond please and thank you and the occasional comment about the weather, delivered so quietly that Marlene sometimes had to lean in to catch it. He never once, in 10 years, asked for a discount or hinted that money was short, or performed the kind of small practice sadness some regulars use to angle for a free refill. He simply sat and ate and left, and somewhere in the 3rd month of his visits, Marlene had done something she never fully planned or decided out loud, not even to herself. She had quietly told Wren, the diner's longtime waitress and Marlene's closest friend in the world, to just tell the man in booth 9 that his check was already settled, and to let Marlene worry about squaring it with the register at the end of the night out of her own tips. Renata Ochoa, who went by Wren to everyone in Hollow Creek and had waited tables at the whistle stop for 11 years, was 39 that summer, sharp-eyed and warm-hearted in exactly the combination that made her extremely good at her job, and she had asked Marlene, the very first week of this arrangement, whether she was sure about giving away free meals to a stranger she knew nothing about. And Marlene had answered the way she answered most things, without much drama, wiping down the pass-through window with a rag while she talked. I don't know a single thing about that man, she'd said, and I don't need to. He's not bothering anybody. He tips exactly what he can, which is nothing, and he never once asked me for a thing. If a quiet old man wants to sit in my diner 3 afternoons a week and eat a bowl of soup in peace, that's not costing me enough to matter, and it might be the only warm meal and the only kind word he gets some weeks. Wren had looked at her for a long moment. The way you look at somebody you've known long enough to recognize when they've already made up their mind in a place words can't reach, and had simply nodded and never brought it up as a question again. From that Thursday forward, for 10 years, the check for booth 9 simply never made it to the man in the gray jacket. Marlene absorbed roughly $6 a visit into her own tip money, which came, over 10 years, and something over 1,500 visits to a sum she never once sat down and calculated, because calculating it would have turned an instinct into an accounting problem, and she never wanted it to be that. His name, she eventually learned in year 4, quite by accident, was Walton. Wren had found an old library card fallen out of his jacket pocket onto the floor of the booth one Thursday and returned it to him without comment, and Marlene had glimpsed the name printed on it before he tucked it away. Walton Pruitt. Just Walton Pruitt. No middle name visible, no address she could make out. Nothing that told her anything at all beyond the fact that he now had a name attached to the quiet, weathered face, and the folded napkin in the exact same order every single time. She never asked him anything further. She never looked him up. In a town the size of Hollow Creek, where everybody's business tended to travel faster than the weather, it was almost strange how little anyone seemed to know about Walton Pruitt, and stranger still that nobody, including Marlene, ever felt the pull to dig. He was simply the quiet man in Booth 9, a fixture of Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday afternoons, the way the flickering light above his booth was a fixture, the way the bell over the door was a fixture, a small permanent detail of a diner that had a great many small permanent details, and Marlene had long since stopped thinking of feeding him as a decision she made and started thinking of it, if she thought of it at all, as simply a fact about how Tuesdays worked. What she did not know, what nobody in Hollow Creek under the age of 50 entirely remembered anymore, was that the name Pruitt was stamped into the very foundations of the town in ways that had nothing to do with library cards. 22 years earlier, Pruitt Cordage and Steel had been the largest employer in 3 counties, a sprawling manufacturing operation on the north edge of town that made industrial wire rope and cable fittings shipped to ports and mills across the eastern half of the country. And at its peak, it had employed 1,100 people, nearly half the working adults in Hollow Creek, including, as it happened, both of Marlene's grandparents and, for a brief stretch in his 20s before the garage, Cole's father. The company bore the name of the family that had built it 3 generations back, and the man who had run it during its final and most difficult chapter, the man who had ultimately made the decision to close the Hollow Creek plant and consolidate operations at a newer, cheaper facility 2 states away, was Walton Bertram Pruitt III, formerly the chairman and chief executive of Pruitt Cordage and Steel, a man whose name Marlene had heard exactly twice in her life before that summer, both times spoken by older relatives with a bitterness that had never fully faded, and never once connected to the quiet stranger eating soup alone in her diner. To understand why a man who had once run a company with 1,100 employees ended up alone in a canvas jacket eating vegetable soup in a diner booth in the town whose economic heart he had personally closed down, you have to go back further than the 10 years Marlene knew him, back to a version of Walton Pruitt that almost nobody in Hollow Creek by that July had ever actually met. He'd been born in 1948 in the big brick house on Chandler Hill that his grandfather built with the company's first profits, had gone east for college and come back anyway, against the advice of nearly everyone who'd left Hollow Creek and never looked back, because his father was aging and the plant needed a Pruitt in the front office who understood both the machinery and the men running it. He had married Eleanor Ashcombe in 1971, a school teacher from the next county over with a laugh that people who knew them both would describe, decades later, as the sound that made the whole Pruitt house feel like something other than a monument to a company. They had one son, Desmond, born in 1974, and for a long stretch of years, the version of Walton Pruitt that Hollow Creek knew was a serious, formal, but basically decent employer, a man who walked the plant floor twice a week and knew a startling number of his workers by their first names and their children's names, a man who kept the company solvent through 2 recessions that closed similar plants in neighboring counties, a man whose name on a paycheck meant something steady in a region where steady was not a small thing. The end came slowly and then all at once, the way these things tend to. Foreign steel imports undercut domestic wire rope pricing through the late 90s and into the new century, and by the time Walton was in his mid-50s, the Hollow Creek plant, aging and expensive to retrofit, was losing money in a way that no amount of loyalty or history could indefinitely paper over. He fought the closure for nearly 4 years, personally against his own board of directors, against consultants who showed him spreadsheets proving the newer, non-union facility in Alabama could produce the same product at 60% of the cost, against his own son Desmond, by then a rising executive within the company himself, who argued with increasing frustration that his father's sentimentality about a hometown was going to sink the entire business and take everyone's jobs down with it, not just the 1,100 in Hollow Creek. Walton had lost that fight in the end, not because he stopped caring, but because the numbers were the numbers. And a company with debts to service and shareholders to answer to could not indefinitely subsidize a plant that lost money every single quarter, simply because its chairman had grown up 3 miles from its front gate. The Hollow Creek facility closed permanently in the autumn. Walton turned 56, and 1,100 people, including men and women who had worked there 20 and 30 years, including people whose fathers had worked there before them, lost their jobs within an 18-month wind-down that Walton, to his credit, insisted on stretching out and cushioning with severance and relocation assistance far more generous than his board wanted to approve. Though none of that generosity was widely known or credited in the town itself, where the story that spread and calcified was simply that a Pruitt had shut the plant and moved the jobs to Alabama, and a Pruitt had gotten richer doing it. Walton never fully recovered from that closure, not in the way people around him expected him to. He kept working, kept expanding the company into other markets over the following decade, kept the Pruitt name prominent on lists of the wealthiest men in the state. But something in him had gone quiet in a way Eleanor noticed before anyone else did, a kind of low-grade, permanent grief for a decision he still believed, intellectually, had been the only responsible one available to him, and still felt in some part of himself that intellect couldn't reach, like a betrayal of every name he'd once known on that plant floor. Eleanor used to tell him in the years afterward that guilt you can't actually undo, just calcifies into something closer to sorrow if you don't find some way to spend it. And she spent the better part of a decade gently, patiently, trying to get him to go back to Hollow Creek, not to run anything, not to fix anything, just to be present in some small way in the town he still, whatever anyone there thought of him, considered home. He always found a reason to put it off. There was always another board meeting, another expansion, another reason next year would be better than this one. Eleanor died 11 years before this story turns, of ovarian cancer that had been caught. By the time anybody caught it, already well past the point where the specialists in Louisville or Cleveland could do much beyond manage what remained of her time with dignity. She was sick for 14 months, and Walton, by every account of people who knew the family, essentially stopped being a chief executive during that stretch in every way except title, delegating almost everything to his senior team and to Desmond, who was 39 by then and had spent his entire adult life being groomed, explicitly and implicitly, to eventually run the company his father and great-grandfather had built. Eleanor's last real conversation with her husband, according to what he would tell Marlene many years later, one of only a handful of times he ever spoke at length in Booth 9, was not about the company or about Desmond, or about anything to do with money at all. She had asked him, in a hospice room with the window cracked because she liked to hear birds even at the end, to please finally go back to Hollow Creek, not to fix it, she'd told him. You can't fix 20 years with a check, Walton, and I don't want you trying to, because it'll just make you feel better and do nothing for anybody else. Just go be a quiet, ordinary person in a town you took something from. Sit in it. Let it be uncomfortable. That's the whole assignment. She had died 4 days later, and Walton, who had spent 39 years of marriage mostly listening to his wife's instincts because they were reliably better than his own, had done, in his own strange and eventually decade-long way, exactly what she asked. He moved into a modest rental house on the quiet end of Chandler Hill Road, the same street where his grandfather's old mansion still stood, though he'd sold that property to the County Historical Society years earlier and never once went back inside it. He told almost no one in Hollow Creek who he was, not out of shame exactly, though shame was certainly present, but out of some instinct that Eleanor had planted in him in that hospice room, that if people knew, they would either perform gratitude he hadn't earned or resentment he had, and either way it would stop being the quiet, uncomfortable, ordinary presence she had asked him to become. He let his hair go gray and long enough to need cutting, wore the same 3 canvas jackets in rotation until they wore thin at the elbows, drove a 12-year-old pickup truck registered to a small holding company that gave away nothing about who owned it, and within 2 years of Eleanor's death had found his way, almost by accident, into a back booth of a diner on Route 68 that made a vegetable soup that reminded him, he told Marlene once, of something his own mother used to make in the big house on the hill before any of them had a dime to their name. The first 2 years of his visits before Marlene's tacit arrangement with Wren began, he had genuinely paid for his own meals, counting out exact change from a thin fold of bills he kept in his jacket pocket, and the eventual shift into the man who never paid at all had nothing to do with a change in his actual finances, which remained, at every point during this story, considerably larger than the gross economic output of Hollow Creek itself. It had to do with a slow, deliberate, almost experimental choice he made, sometime in year 3, to stop paying, quietly, without explanation, simply to see what would happen, the same way a scientist changes one variable in an otherwise stable experiment. He would tell Marlene much later that he expected one of 3 things: to be quietly asked to leave, to be charged double the next visit to cover the loss, or to be handled with the particular condescending gentleness that some people show the poor, a gentleness that manages to be kind and humiliating in the exact same breath. What actually happened was that a cook he had never spoken more than 10 words to simply decided, without comment, without a single follow-up question, that his soup was covered, and then never once, across 10 years and hundreds of visits, brought it up, charged him differently, treated him as a charity case, or looked at him with anything other than the same plain, unbothered warmth she extended to every regular in that diner. It was, he would say later, the single most quietly extraordinary thing that had happened to him in the 11 years since Eleanor died, and it took him 10 years to work up whatever it was inside himself that finally let him tell her why. The seasons moved through Hollow Creek the way they always had. Marlene watched Abby grow from a serious, watchful 3-year-old peeking around the kitchen's swinging door into a serious, watchful 13-year-old who had started that same July asking pointed questions about why her mother worked so many hours for a paycheck that never seemed to stretch quite as far as it should. She watched Sam grow from a baby asleep in a car seat, wedged into the diner's office, into a 9-year-old who developed, without any encouragement from anybody, a habit of waving at the quiet man in booth 9 every time he walked past on his way to the restroom, a habit that Walton, alone among all the diner's regulars, always returned with a small, genuine smile that seemed to cost him something to produce, and that he seemed to want to produce anyway. Gus Peavy got older and grayer and talked more and more often about selling the place to whoever would keep the name, though he never did anything about it. Wren's own 2 kids went through the Hollow Creek public schools a grade ahead of Marlene's, and the 2 women's lives ran alongside each other through a decade of small triumphs and small griefs, the way lives do in a town small enough that everybody's calendar overlaps. And 3 afternoons a week, Walton Pruitt walked into the Whistle Stop Diner, folded himself into booth 9, ate his soup and his cornbread, said thank you in a voice that had gone a little softer and a little more worn with each passing year, left his napkin folded at the exact same square angle every single time, and walked back out into a life that not one person in that diner, save perhaps a longtime waitress with an old library card memory she'd never mentioned again, had any real information about at all. There is a particular Thursday, 3 years into Walton's visits, that Marlene would return to again and again in her memory once she understood everything else, because it was the day she came closest, without knowing it, to learning who he really was, and let the moment pass by without a second thought, the way you let 100 small moments pass by every week without knowing which ones will matter later. It was February, bitter cold, the kind of gray Kentucky winter afternoon where the diner's windows fogged from the inside and the space heater under the counter rattled every time it kicked on, and Walton had come in later than usual, closer to 4 than his usual 2 o'clock, snow melting off his cap onto the shoulders of his jacket. The diner was nearly empty, just old Frank Culpepper nursing a coffee at the counter and a trucker passing through on his way to Lexington, and Marlene had come out from the kitchen herself to bring Walton his soup, since Wren had stepped out to move her car before the tow warning took effect. She set the bowl down, and something made her linger a moment longer than usual. Maybe the cold, maybe an instinct she couldn't name. And she said, making conversation the way she made conversation with every regular, that it must be nice. Retirement, being able to come in at 4 o'clock on a Thursday instead of rushing off to some job. Walton had looked up at her, and for just a moment something moved behind his eyes that she would later understand was closer to physical pain than to anything conversational. And he'd said quietly, "I didn't retire so much as I ran out of reasons to keep doing what I was doing." And then, after a pause, long enough that she almost changed the subject, he'd added, "I used to run a company not far from here. It didn't go well for a lot of people." Marlene, 16 years into a career built on reading a room and knowing when to let a silence sit instead of filling it, had simply nodded and said that a lot of companies around here hadn't gone well for a lot of people, her own grandfather included, and that it wasn't always anybody's fault. Sometimes the world just changed underneath good people trying their best. She had meant it as a small kindness, a way of easing whatever weight had crossed his face, and had no way of knowing that she had just, unknowingly, absolved the one man in the room most responsible for the exact factory closure she was describing. Walton had looked at her for a long moment, something working in his jaw, and then said very quietly, "Thank you for that," and gone back to his soup. And the moment passed, and Marlene had gone back to the kitchen without another thought, filing the whole exchange under the ordinary category of things sad old men occasionally say to a cook who's kind to them. It was not, in fact, an ordinary exchange, and Walton carried it with him for years afterward as one of the strangest, most humbling moments of his entire life, because a woman whose own family had been touched by the very closure he'd ordered had, without knowing any of that, forgiven him for it on the spot, gently, generously, and without ever learning that there was anything specific to forgive. He never told her in all the years that followed exactly how much that February afternoon had cost him to sit with afterward, alone in his rental house on Chandler Hill Road, turning her words over and over. A lot of companies around here hadn't gone well for a lot of people, and it wasn't always anybody's fault, spoken by a woman who had just, for the price of a bowl of soup she wasn't even charging him for, given him something his own conscience had refused to give him in nearly 20 years. There were other small moments scattered across the decade that built up the same quiet architecture of trust without either of them treating them as anything remarkable at the time. There was the Thanksgiving. Walton came in on the one day the diner was technically closed to the public, because Gus always opened for 2 hours in the morning for anyone in town without family nearby to come somewhere warm, and Marlene had made him a full plate, turkey and dressing and green beans, and a slice of the pumpkin pie. Gus's late wife's recipe still produced every November and had sat down across from him for exactly 4 minutes. The only time in 10 years she sat rather than stood at his table and asked him if he had any family of his own to be with. He'd said, after a pause, "I have a son. We don't see eye to eye these days, and a granddaughter I see maybe twice a year, who I think is the best of all of us, though I don't tell her that nearly often enough." Marlene had said only that it sounded like there was still time to tell her, and Walton had nodded slowly and said maybe there was, and that had been the entire conversation, 4 minutes on a holiday morning that Marlene forgot within the week, and Walton thought about every Thanksgiving after. There was the spring Sam, then 6 years old, had walked straight up to Booth, 9 uninvited, while Marlene's back was turned at the register, climbed halfway into the booth across from Walton, and asked him with the total unself-consciousness of a 6-year-old why he always folded his napkin into a square before he left. Walton had looked for a moment entirely undone by the question, and Marlene had come rushing over to pull her son back with an apology already halfway out of her mouth. But Walton had held up one hand, gently, and said, "It's all right." And then, to Sam, "My wife used to fold napkins that way. She said a table should look like somebody cared about it even after you're done with it. I suppose I just kept doing it after she couldn't anymore." Sam, 6 years old, and unequipped to receive that answer with anything but simple honesty, had said, "That's real nice," and then asked if Walton wanted to see his bottle cap collection. And Walton had said, with what Marlene would later remember as the first genuinely unguarded laugh she'd ever heard out of him, that he would like that very much sometime, though the collection never actually made it to the diner, and Sam forgot to bring it up again within the week the way 6-year-olds forget almost everything except the feeling of having been taken seriously by an adult, which he never entirely forgot. There was the December Marlene herself was sick for 11 days with a flu bad enough to keep her home from work for the first time in 6 years, and Wren later told her, once she was back on her feet, that Walton had come in on his usual Tuesday, seen a different cook working the pass-through, asked quietly where Marlene was, and upon hearing she was sick, had left without eating a folded $20 bill under his water glass with instructions to Wren, delivered so quietly Wren almost missed it, to please see that it got to her for whatever she needed, and to not, under any circumstances, mention where it came from unless she asked directly. Marlene had asked directly. Wren had told her the truth. Marlene had tried, twice, to return the money the following week, and Walton had simply declined to take it back, saying only that it wasn't charity, it was interest, on 10 years of soup he still owed her for, and the conversation had ended there because Marlene, despite trying, could not find an argument that beat that one. None of these moments, taken individually, seemed to Marlene like evidence of anything beyond the ordinary. Accumulating decency of a lonely old man who had found in her diner one of the only places left where somebody treated him like a person instead of a name on a door somewhere. She had no way of assembling them into the shape of what they actually were, which was 10 years of careful, deliberate testimony, gathered one folded napkin and one 4-minute Thanksgiving conversation at a time, about exactly the kind of person Marlene Doyle was when she believed nobody of consequence was watching. Walton Pruitt, it turned out, had been watching the entire time, more carefully than she could have imagined, and not because he doubted her, but because somewhere around year 6, an idea had begun forming in the back of his mind that he did not yet have the courage to say out loud, an idea that had everything to do with the town he'd once hollowed out, and with the extraordinary, unpaid debt of vegetable soup that a diner cook had been quietly extending him since the year he first walked in, soaking wet from a February rain with nothing but grief, and a folded 20% of a story he hadn't told anyone yet. The granddaughter Walton mentioned that Thanksgiving was named Callie Pruitt, 26 years old that July, Desmond's only child, and the one member of the Pruitt family who had never fully accepted the quiet estrangement that had settled over her father and grandfather in the years since Eleanor's death. Callie had grown up mostly in Charlotte, where Desmond had relocated the company's operational headquarters a decade earlier, but she had spent enough childhood summers at her grandparents' house before Eleanor's illness that some part of her had never stopped thinking of Walton as the grandfather who used to let her ride on his shoulders through the rose garden Eleanor kept, rather than the increasingly distant, gray, unreachable man her father had learned to describe. In family conversations, Callie found herself disliking more each year, as difficult or declining, or not quite himself anymore. Callie worked as a physical therapist in Charlotte, had deliberately built a life and a career entirely outside the family company, and drove the 6 hours to Hollow Creek to see her grandfather in person 4 or 5 times a year, far more often than her father managed, though even Callie's visits had become, by that July, something Walton mostly deflected with a gentleness that broke her heart a little every time, because he always seemed happiest to see her and always seemed to want her to leave again quickly, as though his own company were something he was trying to protect her from. Desmond Pruitt was 52 that summer and had been chief executive of Pruitt Cordage and Steel, since renamed simply Pruitt Industrial Group after 2 decades of acquisitions and diversification well beyond wire rope, for 11 years, ever since his father had quietly, and to the considerable surprise of the board, stepped back from day-to-day operations in the year after Eleanor's death. Desmond had grown up believing, in the particular way children of demanding, accomplished fathers often believe things without ever examining them, that his father's decision to fight the Hollow Creek closure for 4 losing years had been a sentimental indulgence that nearly sank the company, and that his own subsequent decades of colder, faster, more decisive leadership were a correction of his father's single great weakness. He was not, in the telling most people close to him would give, a cruel man, but he was a man who had learned to treat emotional attachment to a place or a person as a liability to be managed rather than a fact to be honored. And that lesson, absorbed from watching his father nearly destroy a company out of loyalty to a hometown, had calcified over the years into something that looked, from the outside, uncomfortably close to coldness. He loved his father. He would have said so immediately if asked, and would have meant it. He had also over 11 years of running a company his father built and watching his father decline into what Desmond genuinely believed, based on second-hand reports and a handful of strained, brief visits, was some combination of depression and early cognitive decline. Begun to think of his father less as a person whose choices deserved respect, and more as a problem the family would eventually need to solve, quietly, efficiently, before it became a liability to the company or an embarrassment to the Pruitt name. Desmond had heard from a private investigator he had quietly retained 18 months earlier, ostensibly for his father's safety given his age and the isolation of the rental house on Chandler Hill Road, that Walton had developed a habit of eating at a diner in Hollow Creek several times a week, always alone, always the same order, and that, according to the investigator's discreet inquiries, the old man had not paid for a single meal there in years. Desmond had filed this information away as exactly the kind of detail that fit the narrative he had already half decided upon. A wealthy but increasingly diminished man, unable to manage even something as simple as a restaurant tab, being quietly taken advantage of, in Desmond's reading of it, by diner staff who surely knew who he was and were simply too polite or too calculating to say so. It did not occur to Desmond, not once in 18 months of receiving these reports, that the explanation might be simpler and stranger than exploitation, that a cook might simply have decided to feed a lonely old man because it was the right thing to do, and never once looked him up to learn what she could get out of it. Desmond's entire professional life had trained him to see incentives everywhere, and a diner worker giving away free food to a man everyone in town, in his imagining, must surely have recognized as wealthy, looked to him like nothing so much as the opening move of a long con he intended to shut down before it went any further. It was against this backdrop, in the second week of that July, 10 years and 4 months after Walton Pruitt first walked into the Whistle Stop Diner, soaking wet from a rain that had actually been, records would later confirm, a February storm rather than a July one, an error of memory Marlene would later laugh about with Wren more than once, that Walton finally decided the time had come to tell Marlene Doyle who he really was. He had turned 78 that spring. He had begun in the preceding several months to feel a tiredness in his chest and his hands that his doctor in Lexington had described, carefully, as nothing acute but worth paying attention to, the ordinary accumulating weight of a body nearing 80, and that tiredness had done what tiredness in the elderly often does, sharpened his sense that whatever he intended to do with the remaining chapter of his life, he ought to stop postponing it the way he had postponed going back to Hollow Creek for the better part of a decade after Eleanor first asked him to. He had also, and this weighed on him more than the tiredness, begun to notice, in his handful of recent conversations with Desmond, an undertone he did not like, careful questions about his memory, gentle suggestions that he consider having someone check in on him more regularly, a phrase used twice now, for your own protection, that Walton, who had spent 50 years reading boardrooms for exactly this kind of soft procedural language, recognized immediately as the early vocabulary of a fight he did not yet fully understand but could feel, coming the way you feel, weather changing in an old injury. He arrived at the whistle stop on a Tuesday, the second Tuesday of July at his usual 2 o'clock, and Marlene would remember afterward that something about him seemed different from the moment he walked through the door, though she couldn't have named what at the time, some new steadiness in how he carried himself, the posture of a man who has finally decided something after putting it off a very long time. He sat in booth 9 as he always had. He ordered the vegetable soup and cornbread as he always had. And when Marlene came out from the kitchen herself, as she occasionally did during the slow afternoon stretch, to check on her regulars, Walton looked up at her, folded his hands on the table in front of him in a way she had never quite seen him do before, and said, "Marlene, would you have a few minutes to sit with an old man? There's something I should have told you a long time ago, and I find I'm finally ready to say it, if you're willing to hear it." Marlene had untied her apron strings and sat down across from him without a second thought, the way you sit down when a person you've known for a decade, even a quiet stranger you've known mostly through the shape of his silences, finally asks you to. She told Wren to cover the pass-through for a few minutes, and Wren, catching something in Marlene's face, had simply nodded and not asked why. The diner was nearly empty at that hour, just Frank Culpepper dozing over a crossword at the counter and the low murmur of the radio playing something from decades earlier, and Walton had reached into his jacket, the same worn gray canvas jacket he'd worn for 10 years, and pulled out a plain black smartphone that looked, Marlene noticed immediately, considerably newer and more expensive than anything else about him. "I want to start," he said, "by telling you that nothing I'm about to say changes what you did for me for the last 10 years, or why you did it, and I need you to hold on to that fact the entire time I'm talking, because I think it's the most important fact in this entire conversation, and I'm afraid everything else I say is going to try to drown it out. My name is Walton Pruitt. My full name is Walton Bertram Pruitt III. And the reason that name might mean something to you or to your family is that 22 years ago, I was the chairman and chief executive of a company called Pruitt Cordage and Steel. And it was my decision, my final decision, after 4 years of trying everything else, to close the plant here in Hollow Creek that employed, at the time, nearly half the working adults in this town." Marlene sat very still. She would tell Wren later that her first reaction wasn't shock exactly. It was a strange, slow-motion feeling of pieces sliding into place, her grandfather's name coming out of her own mouth at a Sunday dinner years earlier, with a bitterness she'd never fully understood as a child, a company name on a water tower she passed twice a day and had stopped seeing as anything but scenery. And she said, finally, quietly, "You're the Pruitt from the plant, the one that closed." And Walton had nodded and said, "Yes. And I understand if that changes how you see the last 10 years. And if it does, I want you to know I understand completely, and I'm not here to ask you not to feel whatever you're about to feel. I need to tell you the rest of it," he continued, "because the plant closing isn't actually why I'm here today, though it's part of why I came to this particular town instead of somewhere else to disappear into. My wife, Eleanor, died 11 years ago. She asked me, right before she died, to come back here. Not to fix anything. She was very specific about that, just to be present, quietly, in a place I'd taken something from. I've been doing that, badly and slowly, for the last 9 years, and somewhere in year 3 of eating your soup 3 afternoons a week, I stopped paying for it, on purpose, to see what would happen. I expected to be asked to pay double, or asked to leave, or treated like a charity case. What happened instead was that you decided, with no explanation from me and no instructions from anybody, that I was going to eat a hot meal in this diner whether I could pay for it or not, and you never once brought it up, or made me feel small about it, or looked at me differently because of it, for 10 years. I have employed, across my life, more than 11,000 people. I have sat across tables from senators and bank chairmen and men who run companies 20 times the size of mine. And I want to tell you honestly that nothing anyone has ever done for me in a boardroom or otherwise has moved me the way you deciding, on your own, to feed a silent old man in a back booth for a decade has moved me. That's the truth I came here to tell you today. Before anything else. Marlene, who had spent 16 years reading a room for a living, found she had absolutely no professional instinct that covered this particular room, and said, finally, the only thing she could think to say, which was, I didn't do it because I thought you were somebody. I did it because you were nobody, sitting alone, and nobody should eat alone and worried in my diner if I can help it. And Walton had looked at her for a long moment with an expression she would describe to Wren afterward as something between grief and enormous relief, and said, I know. That's exactly why it mattered as much as it did. If you'd known who I was and done it anyway, it would have been generous. Because you didn't know, it was something closer to a mercy. And mercy like that is rarer than generosity. And I don't think you understand yet how rare, because you've never had reason to measure it against anything. He told her more, over the following hour, things he had never told anyone in Hollow Creek and had told almost no one outside his own family. He told her about the factory closure in more detail than the town's collective grudge had ever bothered to preserve. The 4 years he'd fought his own board, the severance packages he'd pushed through over considerable resistance, the fact that he still, 22 years later, could recite from memory the names of the 6 plant floor supervisors who'd worked under him longest, though he doubted any of them would want to hear from him even now. He told her about Eleanor, about the hospice room and the cracked window and the birds she'd wanted to hear, about the instruction that had sent him eventually into a diner booth on Route 68. He told her, more haltingly, about Desmond, about a son he loved and had somehow, across 2 decades of running a company together, mostly stopped actually talking to, about a granddaughter named Callie, who he thought was the best thing his family had produced in 3 generations, and didn't tell nearly often enough. And he told her, finally, the part he'd clearly been building toward the entire conversation, that he did not have very many years left, that his doctor's careful words about his heart had settled into him differently than they might have 10 years earlier, and that he had decided, sitting in booth 9-3 afternoons a week for the better part of a decade, exactly what he wanted to do with what remained of both his fortune and his time, and that almost none of it involved doing what his own family currently expected him to do with it. I want to help this town, he said, not with a plaque or a building with my name back on it. God knows this town has had enough of my name on things. I want to bring real work back here, the kind that doesn't leave in 18 months when a spreadsheet somewhere changes its mind. And I want to do right by you and your family specifically, not as a reward you performed for, because you didn't know there was a prize, but because what you did changed how I think about the entire back half of my life. And that deserves something real in return, whether you want it or not, whether you're comfortable with it or not, and I expect you're about to tell me you're extremely uncomfortable with it. Marlene, who was in fact extremely uncomfortable with it, said exactly that. And Walton had laughed, a real laugh. The first one Marlene had ever actually heard out of him in 10 years, and said that he'd have been disappointed in her if she'd said anything else, and that they had time to work out the specifics slowly, because he wasn't going anywhere just yet. And neither, he suspected, was she. And then he had asked her, in a smaller voice than he'd used for anything else that afternoon, whether she thought Wren would be willing to sit down too, because he owed her a similar conversation, since it had been Wren all along, carrying his checks to the register and never once asking Marlene why. Marlene drove home that evening in a fog she would later describe as feeling like she'd been handed a second, entirely different map of a town she thought she already knew by heart. She did not tell Cole right away, not because she meant to keep it from him, but because she genuinely did not know how to begin the sentence. Your Booth 9 regular for the last 10 years is worth more money than our entire county, and needed the drive home and the better part of dinner to find a version of it that didn't sound like the opening of a joke. She finally told him after the kids had gone to bed, sitting across from him at their own kitchen table the way she'd sat across from Walton that afternoon, and Cole, who had spent 16 years married to a woman he trusted more than he trusted most facts, had listened all the way through without interrupting once, which was, for Cole, its own small miracle, and had said at the end of it, only, well, I always did wonder what kind of a man folds a napkin that precisely every single time. Then he'd reached across the table and taken her hand and said the thing Marlene would repeat to herself many times over the following months whenever the whole situation threatened to feel too large to hold. None of this changes who you were being for 10 years before anybody offered you a single thing for it. Whatever happens next, that part already happened, and it was already enough. All by itself, whether or not one more thing ever came from it. Wren's conversation with Walton happened 3 days later, in the same booth, at the same hour, and went, by Wren's own later account, almost identically to Marlene's, right down to the moment Walton told her that carrying his unpaid checks to the register for 10 years without ever once asking Marlene why had been its own quiet, specific kindness that he intended to make sure she understood he'd noticed. Wren cried, briefly and without much embarrassment about it, and told him that she'd always assumed Marlene simply had a soft spot for lonely old men, which was true, and had never imagined there was a larger story sitting 3 feet away from her cash register 3 afternoons a week for a decade. Walton told her, as he'd told Marlene, that whatever came next would take time to work out properly, and that he intended for Wren to be part of whatever shape it eventually took, because a diner with only one person who mattered to it wasn't the diner he'd come to love over 10 years of vegetable soup. Word did not spread through Hollow Creek immediately, and Marlene would credit that later to the fact that for the first several weeks after Walton's revelation, almost nothing visible actually changed. He kept coming in 3 afternoons a week. He kept ordering the same soup and cornbread, though he insisted, gently but firmly, on paying for it now, an arrangement Marlene fought for exactly 1 afternoon before recognizing that this particular fight was not one she was going to win against a man who had negotiated corporate mergers for 4 decades. He kept folding his napkin the same way. From the outside, to anyone glancing into the whistle stop on a Tuesday afternoon, nothing at all had changed about the quiet old man in booth 9. What had changed was happening several layers beneath the surface, in a series of quiet meetings Walton began holding, first with his personal attorney in Lexington, then with an economic development consultant he retained privately rather than through his own company's channels, specifically so that Desmond's office would have no early visibility into what his father was actually planning. What Walton was planning, in broad strokes, he shared with Marlene and Wren over several subsequent Tuesday and Thursday conversations that summer involved 3 separate but connected pieces. The first was the Whistle Stop Diner itself, which Gus Peavy, now 71 and increasingly ready to retire for real, had quietly confirmed to Walton he intended to sell within the next year or 2. Most likely to a regional restaurant group that had already approached him twice with offers Gus found insulting both in price and in their explicit plans to gut the interior and rebrand the place as something called a Route 68 Grill and Tap. Walton intended to purchase the diner himself through the same holding company that owned his truck, structure the deed so it could never be sold to an outside buyer without the consent of whoever was actually running the kitchen, and hand ownership, once Gus was ready to step back fully, to Marlene and Wren jointly, an arrangement he insisted on discussing with Gus directly and letting Gus be the one to propose the exact terms, because he said, more than once, that this needed to be Gus's gift to 2 women who'd earned his trust over a decade, not merely Walton's money moving through Gus as a formality. The second piece was larger and took considerably longer to work out. Walton intended to fund, primarily through his own personal fortune rather than through Pruitt Industrial Group's corporate balance sheet, a new manufacturing facility on the same north edge of town where the old Pruitt cordage and steel plant had once stood. Though the new facility would produce something entirely different, precision components for renewable energy infrastructure, a growth industry Walton's own investment team had been quietly tracking for years, and that, according to every analysis he commissioned, could sustainably employ between 300 and 400 people in Hollow Creek within its first 5 years of operation, without requiring the kind of ongoing corporate subsidy that had made the original plant's finances so fragile. He intended this facility to be independently capitalized, professionally managed by people with no family connection to him at all, and structured from day one with protections against the exact kind of relocation that had gutted the town 2 decades earlier, a commitment Walton was determined to make binding rather than merely promised, because he said to Marlene, more than once that summer, that a promise from a Pruitt was exactly the currency Hollow Creek had the least reason left to trust, and he intended to build something that didn't depend on anyone believing his word alone. The third piece was the one Walton discussed least, and the one that would ultimately matter most to Marlene's own family specifically. He intended to establish a modest permanent educational and emergency assistance fund for Hollow Creek residents, seeded initially at $2 million and structured to grow through conservative investment over subsequent decades, administered by a small local board rather than by any Pruitt family member or company employee, that would help cover things like unexpected medical bills, community college tuition, and small business startup costs for residents who qualified. And he told Marlene, the afternoon he first described it to her, that he wanted her, specifically, to be one of the fund's founding board members, not because of what she'd done for him, though that was certainly part of it, but because in 10 years of watching her run that diner, he had never once seen her make a decision about another person's dignity that he would have made differently. And that instinct, he said, was worth considerably more to a fund like this than any amount of financial expertise the other board members could bring to it. None of these 3 plans had progressed past private conversations and preliminary paperwork by the time Desmond Pruitt found out about any of it, which he did in the second week of August, exactly 1 month after his father first sat down with Marlene, not through any leak from Hollow Creek, but through his own private investigator, who had noticed Walton's attorney in Lexington filing several unusual property and trust documents and had, per his standing instructions, reported the activity directly to Desmond as a matter of course. Desmond read the initial summary of what his father was apparently planning, a diner purchase, a manufacturing facility funded personally rather than corporately, a trust naming a diner cook as a founding board member, and felt, by his own later admission, a genuine, immediate alarm that had almost nothing to do with money and almost everything to do with a conclusion he arrived at within minutes and would spend the next several weeks failing to fully let go of, that his 78-year-old father, isolated, grieving, and increasingly erratic by Desmond's own private assessment, had been identified and skillfully cultivated by a diner worker in a small Kentucky town who had spent a decade patiently earning his trust for exactly this moment. Desmond arrived in Hollow Creek on a Thursday morning in late August, unannounced, driving himself rather than sending a car, which Marlene would later understand was Desmond's own way of trying to keep the visit feeling smaller and less alarming than it actually was, though nothing about a man in an expensive charcoal suit stepping out of a black sedan in the Whistle Stop's gravel parking lot at 9 a.m. managed to feel small to anyone who saw it. He came into the diner and asked, at the counter, for Marlene Doyle by name, and Wren, recognizing something in his bearing immediately, went to get Marlene from the kitchen with an expression that made Marlene's stomach drop before she'd even wiped her hands on her apron. Desmond introduced himself in the small back office Gus kept more as storage than a working space, and Marlene would remember afterward that he was not rude exactly, not in the way she'd braced herself for, but that there was a controlled, careful quality to everything he said that felt less like a conversation and more like a deposition being conducted with excessive politeness. He told her he was aware of her decade-long relationship with his father, aware of the recent property and trust filings, aware that his father intended to name her to a charitable board and structure a diner purchase in her favor, and he asked her, directly, whether she had been aware, prior to his father's disclosure in July, of who Walton Pruitt actually was. Marlene told him the truth, which was no, not until that Tuesday in July, 10 years and 4 months after Walton first walked in soaking wet, and Desmond had studied her for a long moment and said, with the particular gentleness people use right before saying something ungentle, that he wanted to believe her, and that he hoped she'd understand that a man in his position, watching an isolated 78-year-old father who had shown, in Desmond's professional opinion, clear signs of increasingly erratic decision-making over the preceding several months, could not simply take her word for it, however sincerely offered, when the financial exposure involved ran into the tens of millions of dollars. Marlene, who had spent the better part of that summer absorbing one enormous fact after another with a composure that surprised even herself, found that this particular sentence, erratic decision-making, was the first thing anyone had said to her since July that made her genuinely angry rather than merely overwhelmed. She told Desmond evenly but without softening it that his father had sat across from her in that same diner every Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday afternoon for 10 years, remembered every conversation, remembered her children's names and ages, remembered which of her regulars had which health problems and which grandchildren, and had, in her own direct observation, one of the sharpest, most careful minds of anyone she'd ever served, and that if Desmond wanted to know why his father hadn't told his own son about any of this before telling a diner cook, he might consider asking himself that question with slightly less certainty about the answer already being her fault. Desmond had not enjoyed that response, and the conversation ended that first morning without resolution, though it ended, notably, without Desmond having actually accused her of anything specific enough to argue with directly, which Marlene understood driving home that night was its own kind of tactic, one that left her with a vague, unshakable sense of having been suspected of something without ever being told exactly what. Callie Pruitt arrived in Hollow Creek 4 days later. On her own initiative and against her father's explicit preference that she stay out of it, having heard about her father's visit to the diner from Walton himself in a phone call that had left her, by her own account, furious in a way she rarely allowed herself to be with her own father. She drove the 6 hours from Charlotte in a single stretch, arrived at the diner just before closing, and asked, quietly, to speak with Marlene, introducing herself not as a Pruitt, but simply as Callie, Walton's granddaughter, and Marlene, recognizing the family resemblance in the eyes before the name even registered, had sat down with her at booth 9 itself, an arrangement that felt, to both of them without either saying so, like it mattered that it happened at that specific table. Callie told Marlene, in the unhurried, careful way of someone who has rehearsed an apology in the car for 6 hours and still isn't sure she's getting it right, that she was deeply sorry for whatever her father had said or implied, that she had grown up watching her father and grandfather slowly stop being able to talk to each other in the years after her grandmother died, that she had visited Hollow Creek enough times over the past decade to have twice, without ever putting it together, driven past the whistle stop on Route 68 without any idea her own grandfather was inside it 3 afternoons a week, and that she wanted, more than anything else in this entire complicated situation, for someone to actually ask her grandfather what he wanted, rather than deciding on his behalf what was best for him from 6 hours away. "My father thinks he's protecting Grandpa," Callie said. "And I think, somewhere underneath that, he actually believes it. I don't think he's lying to himself on purpose. But I've watched my grandfather more closely than my father has in the last 5 years, probably more closely than he has in the last 15, and I have never once seen anything in him that looked like decline. I've seen grief. Those are not the same thing, and I don't think my father has let himself learn the difference, because the difference would mean admitting he doesn't actually know his own father anymore, and that's a harder thing to admit than erratic decision-making." Marlene had asked her, directly, what she thought was going to happen next, and Callie had said, with the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent her whole adult life managing a family conflict she didn't create, that she suspected her father was going to push, formally, for some kind of independent evaluation of Walton's competency, not necessarily out of malice, but out of a genuine, misguided certainty that it was the responsible thing to do before allowing tens of millions of dollars to move outside the family's traditional structures, and that if that evaluation happened, and if it came back showing exactly what Callie already knew it would show, a sharp, entirely competent 78-year-old man making decisions he had every legal and moral right to make, her father was going to have to either accept that or escalate into something uglier, a formal guardianship petition, the kind of fight that tore families and small towns apart in the newspapers for months at a time. "I don't want that for him," Callie said, meaning her grandfather, "and I don't want it for you either," meaning Marlene, "and I definitely don't want my father to become the villain in his own father's last good years. Because I don't think that's actually who he is, even though I understand completely why it might look that way from where you're standing." Callie's prediction proved accurate within 3 weeks. Desmond, having returned to Charlotte unsatisfied by his conversation with Marlene and increasingly convinced, after a follow-up call with his own private investigator, turned up nothing more sinister than a decade of ordinary kindness, that the situation nonetheless required formal legal intervention regardless of what it turned up, filed a petition in Franklin County Probate Court requesting an independent competency evaluation of Walton Bertram Pruitt III, along with a temporary, protective freeze on any new trust or property transactions pending the evaluation's outcome. The filing was, under Kentucky law, a matter of public record, and within 4 days, a business reporter for a Louisville paper who covered the state's wealthiest families had turned it into a story. Pruitt heir seeks competency review of aging billionaire father amid unusual small-town financial dealings, and within a week of that story running, Hollow Creek, a town of just under 3,000 people that had not seen its name in a statewide paper since a tornado passed through 18 years earlier, found itself the subject of considerably more outside attention than it knew what to do with. Marlene experienced this attention less as excitement and more as a kind of low, constant static that followed her everywhere for most of September. A television crew from a Lexington station spent 2 days parked across from the diner, hoping for footage of Walton, who declined every request for comment and stopped coming in for nearly 10 days on his attorney's advice, which worried Marlene more than almost anything else that happened that month, because it was the longest stretch in a decade that Booth 9 had sat empty during his usual hours. Reporters called the diner's landline so often that Wren eventually started answering with a flat, practiced no comment before the caller had finished their first sentence. Somebody in town, never identified, gave an anonymous quote to the Louisville paper describing Marlene as, quote, "a schemer who'd had her hooks in that poor old man for years," a phrase that reached Marlene through 3 separate well-meaning neighbors before the day was out, and that hurt her, she would admit later. Considerably more than she expected anything a stranger said about her to hurt, precisely because it recast 10 years of an instinct she still believed, all the way down, had nothing to do with money, as something calculated and small. It was during this stretch, the worst 2 weeks of the entire ordeal by Marlene's own account, that Cole did something she would remember for the rest of her life as one of the clearest demonstrations of who her husband actually was. He drove to Franklin County Courthouse on a Wednesday, took an unpaid day off from the garage, and sat through the entire preliminary hearing on the competency petition, not to testify, since he hadn't been called, but simply to be a face in the gallery that Marlene could look at if she needed to. And when a reporter outside the courthouse asked him, after the hearing adjourned, what he thought about his wife being accused of manipulating a vulnerable billionaire, Cole had said, on camera, in a clip that would end up running on the Lexington station's evening broadcast, that his wife had been feeding a lonely old man free soup for 10 years before anybody in this story had a dollar figure attached to them, and that anybody who thought that kind of decade of quiet kindness was a con job had clearly never actually met his wife and didn't deserve an explanation from either of them. The competency evaluation itself took place over 2 days in late September, conducted by a neuropsychologist named Dr. Priya Reyes, retained not by Desmond, but by Walton's own attorneys, specifically to ensure the process could not later be characterized as anything other than independent and rigorous, since Walton, through his counsel, had insisted from the beginning that he welcomed the evaluation entirely, having nothing to hide and considerable confidence in what it would show. Dr. Reyes administered a full battery of cognitive, memory, and executive function assessments over those 2 days, and her written findings, filed with the court in early October, stated in careful clinical language that Walton Pruitt demonstrated cognitive function, memory, and executive reasoning entirely consistent with a man 10 to 15 years younger than his chronological age, with no indicators whatsoever of the kind of impairment that would support any claim of diminished capacity, and further noted in a passage Marlene would later read more times than she could count, that Mr. Pruitt's recent financial and philanthropic decisions appeared on clinical examination to reflect not confusion, but an unusually clear, deliberate, values-driven process of reckoning with decisions made earlier in his career, a process Dr. Reyes characterized in language unusually warm for a clinical report as psychologically healthy rather than concerning. The hearing, where those findings were formally entered into the record, was the first time Marlene and Desmond and Callie and Walton were all in the same room together, and it did not go the way the newspaper coverage leading up to it had led most observers to expect. Desmond's attorney attempted, in the opening stretch of the hearing, to characterize Dr. Reyes's findings as insufficient, suggesting the evaluation might not have accounted fully for the specific, high-stakes financial judgment required to manage a fortune of Walton's size. A line of questioning Dr. Reyes handled calmly by noting, evenly, that she had in fact specifically assessed financial and executive decision-making capacity as part of the standard battery and found no deficits whatsoever, and that she would be curious to know what additional standard existed, clinically speaking, beyond the one she had already applied. Marlene watched Desmond's jaw work silently at that answer, the particular expression of a man recalculating an argument in real time and not liking where the numbers were landing. And it was Callie, sitting beside her father, who spoke next, quietly but clearly enough for the whole room to hear, saying that she loved her father and did not think he had started this process out of cruelty, but that she thought it was long past time for someone in this family to simply ask her grandfather, directly and respectfully, what he actually wanted, instead of continuing to build a legal case around a man who was sitting right there and had not, in fact, lost the ability to speak for himself. It was Walton himself who spoke last that day, standing slowly with his attorney's quiet assistance and addressing the room. According to the court transcript, Marlene would keep a copy of for the rest of her life, in a voice that had none of the tremor Desmond's petition had implied, and all of the steadiness of a man who had run boardrooms for 4 decades. He said that he understood his son's fear, that he had watched Eleanor's long illness alongside Desmond and knew what it did to a person to watch someone they loved slip away and then spend years afterward flinching at every sign that it might be happening again to someone else they loved, and that he did not, even now, think Desmond was acting from anything except a frightened, imperfect kind of love. But he said also that he was 78 years old, that he had spent the better part of his professional life making decisions with far higher stakes and far less certainty than this one, and that he intended, regardless of what the court decided about guardianship, to spend whatever years he had left doing right by a town he had once hurt and a family in it who had shown him, without knowing they were being watched or tested or measured at all, exactly what he wanted the last chapter of his own life to look like. "If my own son cannot yet trust that I know my own mind," Walton said, "then I am sorry for that, more sorry than I can easily say. But I will not let that unresolved sorrow become the reason Marlene Doyle and Renata Ochoa and 300 or 400 future workers in Hollow Creek lose the only good thing to come out of 22 years of my own worst decision." The petition was withdrawn by Desmond's own counsel 11 days later, before a final ruling was ever issued, a fact the Louisville paper reported in 4 paragraphs on page 6, considerably less prominent than the story that had started the entire ordeal 3 weeks earlier. The withdrawal of the petition did not by itself repair anything between Walton and Desmond, and Marlene, who had by then spent enough hours in courtroom hallways and quiet diner booths listening to both men that she felt she understood something of the shape of their particular grief, would say later that the actual repair happened somewhere she never witnessed directly, in a series of private conversations between father and son that neither man ever fully described to her, except for one detail Walton did share, weeks afterward, over a bowl of soup he now insisted on paying full price for. He told her that he had finally said to Desmond, in a conversation that lasted most of a Sunday afternoon at Desmond's own kitchen table in Charlotte, the thing Eleanor had once said to him in a hospice room 11 years earlier, that guilt you cannot undo calcifies into something worse if you never find a way to spend it, and that he suspected Desmond had spent the last 2 decades quietly, unconsciously guilty about having argued so hard as a younger executive for the very plant closure that still haunted his father, and that some of Desmond's fear about Walton's mental state, some of the urgency behind the competency petition, had less to do with Walton's actual behavior and more to do with a son who had never forgiven himself for winning an argument he'd once been so certain was right. Desmond, for his part, would tell Callie, in a conversation she later shared with Marlene with his permission, that watching Dr. Reyes's evaluation and watching his father stand up in that courtroom and speak with total clarity and total command of a room the way he'd done in 100 boardrooms Desmond had watched him dominate as a younger man, had forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth about his own motives that he'd been avoiding for months. That some part of his urgency about protecting the family fortune from what he'd assumed was exploitation had actually been about protecting his own inheritance and his own sense of what the Pruitt name was supposed to mean, dressed up in his own mind as concern for his father's welfare, and that untangling those two motives from each other, once he actually sat still long enough to try, had been harder and more humbling than he expected. He apologized to Marlene directly, in November, in a phone call he made himself rather than through an attorney. An apology Marlene accepted without much drama, telling him only that she hoped he and his father found their way back to something easier than what she'd witnessed in that courthouse. Because whatever else was true, a man deserved a son who trusted him, and a son deserved a father who let himself be trusted, and it seemed to her, watching from the outside, that both of those things had gone missing somewhere in the years after Eleanor died, and that neither Walton nor Desmond was entirely to blame for how that happened. By the following spring, the practical pieces of what Walton had first described to Marlene the previous July had begun taking real shape. Gus Peavy sold the Whistle Stop Diner in March in an arrangement he insisted on structuring almost entirely himself once Walton made clear the choice of successor was Gus's alone to make, and he chose, in the end, to transfer ownership jointly to Marlene and Wren, rather than to either woman individually, saying at the small gathering Gus held in the diner after hours to announce it, that in 50 years running that place he had never seen two people love an ugly, flickering pie case and a drafty back booth as much as the two of them did, and that it belonged in the family, even if the family wasn't blood. Wren cried. Marlene cried harder. They reopened 3 weeks later under the same name, with the same menu, the same booths, the same bell over the door, and a small, unobtrusive plaque near booth 9, added at Wren's insistence over Walton's mild objection, that read simply, "In memory of nothing lost that kindness couldn't hold," with no name attached to it at all, because both women agreed that Walton would have hated anything more specific than that, and both women were right. The manufacturing facility, named Ashcombe Precision, after Eleanor's maiden name, at Walton's own insistence, broke ground on the old Pruitt cordage and steel site the following autumn, fully 15 months after Walton first sat down across from Marlene in booth 9, and it was structured exactly as he had described it that summer, independently capitalized, professionally managed by an executive team with no family ties to the Pruitts at all, and bound by a set of covenants Walton's attorneys had drafted specifically to make relocation, or sudden closure, extraordinarily difficult, without triggering severe financial penalties, payable directly into the same community fund, the diner plaque quietly gestured toward. It began hiring in earnest the following spring, and among its first 100 employees were 3 people whose names Marlene recognized immediately from her own childhood, including a woman named Deborah Halloway, the daughter of the very Mrs. Halloway, whose husband had lost his job at the tire plant decades earlier and who had once received a foil-wrapped plate of pot roast from Marlene's own mother, a coincidence Marlene mentioned to Walton one Thursday afternoon that made the old man go quiet for a long moment, before saying only that some things, apparently, did eventually come back around, even when nobody was watching for them to. The Hollow Creek Community Fund, seated at its promised $2 million and administered by a 5-person local board that included Marlene as a founding member alongside a retired school teacher, a pediatric nurse, the Baptist church's pastor, and a young small business owner who ran the town's hardware store, made its first round of grants that same spring, covering a community college scholarship for a graduating senior whose family had been on the fence about whether college was even possible, an emergency medical bill for a retired mill worker's wife, and a small business loan for a young couple hoping to open a laundromat on the town's main strip. Decisions Marlene found herself more nervous discussing in board meetings than she had ever been nervous about anything in 16 years of running a diner kitchen, precisely because they mattered in a way that felt different from getting an order right, and precisely because Walton had chosen her for exactly the instinct she now had to trust in a much larger, more consequential room than a diner booth. There is a scene from that winter, between the withdrawal of Desmond's petition and the groundbreaking on Ashcombe Precision, that Marlene considers, whenever she tells this story to anyone who asks, the truest measure of everything that had actually changed and everything that hadn't. It happened on a Saturday afternoon in January, deep in the kind of cold that keeps most of Hollow Creek indoors, when Abby, 13 going on 14 by then, sharper-tongued than ever and newly, painfully aware of how much attention her family had attracted over the preceding 6 months, asked her mother directly, while helping fold laundry in the kitchen, whether they were rich now. Marlene had set down the shirt she was folding and thought about the question longer than Abby expected her to, and had finally said that they were not rich in the way Abby probably meant it, that most of what Walton wanted to do was going into the diner and the fund and the new plant, and that her own family's part in it was mostly the house, paid off outright rather than owned by the bank, and a small college fund set up for both her and Sam that neither of them could touch until they actually needed it for something like tuition. And Abby, listening to all of this with the flat, assessing expression she'd inherited from nobody in particular but had somehow perfected anyway, had asked the real question underneath the first one, which was whether her mother had done what she did for 10 years because some part of her had hoped, even a little, that it might turn into something like this. Marlene had answered that question more carefully than she'd answered almost anything else that entire year, because she understood it was the question her daughter actually needed answered honestly, not the polite version. She told Abby that she genuinely, all the way down, had not hoped for anything, that if Walton Pruitt had turned out to be exactly what he appeared to be for 10 years, a lonely old man with nothing, she would have kept doing exactly what she did for exactly the same reasons, and that the only way any of what happened afterward could mean what it was supposed to mean was if that first part stayed true, no matter how the story ended. But she also told Abby, because she thought her daughter deserved the more complicated truth alongside the simple one, that she had absolutely thought about money plenty of times over those 10 years, standing at that register, doing math against a gas bill or a school shoe budget, wondering some weeks if giving away even a few free bowls of soup was something they could actually afford, and that those two things, the plain decision to be kind regardless of cost, and the ordinary, human worry about whether they could afford it, had lived in her at the exact same time for a decade without canceling each other out, and that she wanted Abby to understand that being a good person didn't require never worrying about money. It just required deciding, each time the actual moment came, which worry got to make the decision. Abby had considered this for a long moment and said only that she thought that was a harder answer than most parents would have given her, and Marlene had said that most questions worth asking honestly only had hard answers. And that had, more or less, been the end of the conversation, though Marlene thought about it often in the months that followed and suspected Abby did too. Callie Pruitt became, over that same winter, an increasingly regular presence at the Doyle family's kitchen table, rather than merely at the diner, a friendship that began the evening she'd driven 6 hours to apologize on her father's behalf, and deepened, gradually, through a shared instinct both women recognized in each other almost immediately, the instinct to actually look at the people around them rather than past them. Callie began driving up from Charlotte more often once the worst of the legal conflict had passed, sometimes staying with Walton in the Chandler Hill Road rental house, sometimes simply passing through Hollow Creek on her way to somewhere else, and stopping at the diner for a meal she now insisted on paying full price for, despite Marlene's genuine reluctance to let her. And it was Callie, in February, who first suggested to Walton, gently, that the funds board might benefit from adding a younger member with some connection to the medical and rehabilitation needs she saw constantly in her own physical therapy practice, a suggestion that led, eventually, to Callie herself joining the Hollow Creek Community Funds Board the following year as its 6th member, commuting up from Charlotte for quarterly meetings in an arrangement that struck everyone involved, including Callie, as a strange and wonderful thing to have become part of her actual life, rather than merely her family's complicated history. Walton's health did not improve over that year in any of the dramatic ways a simpler version of this story might have offered. His doctor's careful language about his heart proved, in the end, to have been careful for good reason, and he was hospitalized briefly that following summer, almost exactly 2 years after he first told Marlene who he was, with an arrhythmia that resolved with treatment, but that left him, afterward, visibly more tired, moving more slowly between booth 9 and the diner's front door, though he never once stopped coming, 3 afternoons a week, for as long as his body allowed it. Marlene sat with him in the hospital in Lexington for 2 of those days, not because anyone asked her to, but because Callie had called her, crying from the hospital hallway, saying that her grandfather had asked, twice, whether Marlene knew, and Marlene had driven the 90 minutes without hesitating and sat in a plastic hospital chair holding the hand of a man who had once run a company with 11,000 employees, and who told her, in a voice thinner than she'd ever heard from him, that whatever else happened to him now, he wanted her to know that the 10 years before she knew his name had been, without any real competition, the best and most honest 10 years of his entire adult life. Because for once in 8 decades, not one single person around him had been treating him a certain way because of what he could do for them, and he did not think, honestly, that he would have understood the difference if she hadn't shown it to him first, one bowl of soup at a time, long before he ever had a reason to explain himself. There is a part of this story Marlene rarely tells strangers because it involves a conflict that had nothing to do with Desmond or the courthouse or the Louisville newspaper, a conflict that happened entirely within the walls of the Whistle Stop Diner itself, among the very people the story's happy ending was supposedly meant for, and she considers it, on reflection, one of the more honest parts of the whole decade, because it proves that even a story about kindness rewarded doesn't skip the ordinary friction of human beings trying to share something valuable without anybody feeling shortchanged. The friction began with Patsy Lund, a waitress who had worked the evening shift at the Whistle Stop for 6 years, long enough to consider herself a fixture of the place in her own right, and who learned, along with the rest of the staff, about Gus's plan to transfer ownership jointly to Marlene and Wren, rather than distributing some form of ownership or profit sharing more broadly among the diner's other employees. Patsy mentioned it during a slow Sunday shift to 2 of the diner's regulars, in a tone calibrated to sound like idle commentary rather than a grievance, remarking that it seemed strange that some folks had been in exactly the right booth at exactly the right time and now stood to inherit an entire business, while other folks who'd worked just as hard got nothing but a raise if they were lucky. The comment made its way back to Marlene within a day, carried by a well-meaning line cook named Terrence. Marlene's instinct was defensive, and she made herself sit with it for a full day before responding because she did not want to handle it the way she'd wanted to in the heat of the moment. Instead, she asked Gus whether he had considered structuring some form of profit sharing for the diner's longer-tenured staff as part of the ownership transition, separate from her own specific arrangement with Wren, which she still believed was fundamentally about a decade of a particular relationship rather than a general reward for diner employment. Gus, who had quietly worried about exactly this friction himself, agreed readily, and the two of them worked out a modest annual profit-sharing arrangement, extending to any employee with 3 or more years of tenure, funded out of the diner's own operating margins rather than out of Walton's separate gift, so it would exist independent of Walton's money entirely. Marlene then sat down with Patsy directly, alone, and told her plainly that she'd heard what she'd said to the Sunday regulars, that she understood why it might look like an unfair windfall, and that a profit-sharing structure was being built into the new ownership specifically to address that imbalance. Patsy, to her credit, admitted she'd spoken out of a raw flash of jealousy she wasn't proud of, and the two women talked for the better part of an hour about money and fairness and the particular sting of watching someone else's decade of quiet, unrewarded kindness turn out to matter in a way that made your own decade of hard, ordinary work feel smaller by comparison. It wasn't a perfectly resolved conversation, and Patsy stayed a little cooler toward Marlene for a while. But the profit-sharing structure held, and by the time Ashcombe Precision broke ground the following autumn, Patsy Lund was one of the loudest voices in the diner celebrating the news. There was a second friction, smaller but sharper in the moment, between Marlene and Wren themselves, in October, after Gus first floated joint ownership, but before any papers were signed. Wren, who had spent 11 years at the Whistle Stop to Marlene's 16, found herself unexpectedly resentful that Walton's first, deepest conversation had happened with Marlene alone, and that even now Marlene's name tended to appear first in how the ownership and the funds board were described, even though Wren had carried every one of those unpaid checks to the register herself for 10 years without ever once asking why. She said as much to Marlene one closing shift, admitting she felt, absurdly she knew, like the sidekick in her own decade of the same quiet kindness. And Marlene, rather than getting defensive, started crying almost immediately because she recognized Wren was right about something real, and said she could not have kept the arrangement going for 10 years without Wren simply agreeing, week after week, to carry a check to the register and say nothing. The two women talked until well past midnight and came out of it closer than they'd been in 11 years of friendship, precisely because they'd finally said the uncomfortable, entirely human thing out loud. Frank Culpepper deserves a place in this story too, because he represents something Marlene came to understand only slowly over that first strange year, which was that not everyone in Hollow Creek was going to greet the idea of Walton Pruitt's redemption with open arms, and that their resistance did not make them small or bitter people, but people who had lost something real 22 years earlier. Frank was 76 that year, had worked the Pruitt cordage and steel plant floor for 26 years before the closure, had never found work afterward that paid within 20% of his old wage, and had recognized Walton Pruitt almost immediately within his first year of visits, long before Marlene ever did, and had simply chosen, deliberately, to say nothing to anyone about it. He told her, once the worst of the legal drama had passed, that he hadn't been protecting Walton by staying silent. He'd been letting him sit in it, and that he wasn't standing up and cheering about any of this the way some folks in town were, because a new factory with a dead man's wife's name on it didn't buy back 26 years of his working life, and he didn't think it was supposed to. Marlene told him she understood and asked whether he wanted her to say anything to Walton on his behalf, and Frank said no, that it wasn't her job to broker a reconciliation that belonged to the two men directly or not at all. It was Walton, in the end, who initiated it himself that November, walking the length of the counter to sit down, unannounced, beside Frank for the first time in a decade of sharing the same diner. Neither man ever described what passed between them that morning, but Wren noticed that Frank's coffee mug got a small, hand-painted F added to it on the hook behind the counter that December. The same kind of mug every longtime regular eventually earned, and that Frank started nodding to Walton across the diner most mornings after that. Sam's bottle cap collection, the one he'd offered to show Walton back when he was 6 years old, and Walton had said he'd like that very much sometime, finally made its way to the diner the following spring, when Sam was 10, in a shoebox he carried in with both hands like it contained something fragile. And Walton, who by then moved more slowly than he had a year earlier, but still made Booth 9 3-afternoons a week whenever his health allowed it, spent nearly 45 minutes going through every single bottle cap with Sam, asking real questions about where each one came from, and telling Sam, at the end of it, that he had once, a very long time ago, collected railroad spikes as a boy, a hobby his own father had considered undignified for a Pruitt and had eventually made him give up, and that he wished, looking back on 80 years of a complicated life, that he'd fought harder to keep collecting the small, useless, wonderful things a boy collects before the world convinces him only certain things are worth keeping. Sam had asked whether Walton still had any of the railroad spikes, and Walton had said no. His father had made him give them to a scrap drive during a war Sam wasn't alive for and couldn't quite picture. And Sam, with the blunt sympathy of a 10-year-old, had said that was a real shame, and offered Walton one of his own duplicate bottle caps to keep. A faded Royal Crown Cola cap Sam had 2 of, and Walton had accepted it with what Marlene, watching from the pass-through, would describe afterward as more visible emotion than she'd seen him show at any point during the entire courthouse ordeal, and had kept that bottle cap, she later learned, in the same jacket pocket where he'd once carried a folded $20 bill for her for the rest of his life. The groundbreaking ceremony for Ashcombe Precision took place on a bright, cold morning that November, 15 months after Walton first told Marlene who he was. On the same acreage where the old Pruitt cordage and steel plant had stood before it was demolished a decade earlier and left in the years since as a flat, weed-choked field the town had mostly stopped looking at directly. Walton, using a cane by then, but insisting on standing rather than sitting for the ceremony, spoke for perhaps 90 seconds, considerably shorter than the economic development consultant's prepared remarks or the county judge executive's speech, and said only that he did not believe a groundbreaking ceremony could undo 22 years, that he was not there to ask anyone in Hollow Creek to forget what his decision had cost them, only to ask that they judge this new facility and the people who would run it long after he was gone on what it actually did over the coming decades, rather than on what he said about it on a cold morning in November. He then asked Marlene, to the visible surprise of the assembled local officials and the one remaining newspaper reporter still covering the story, to join him at the ceremonial shovel rather than Desmond, who stood a few feet back beside Callie, and said into the small portable microphone that this facility existed because a woman standing beside him had shown him one bowl of soup at a time for 10 years, exactly what it looked like to treat another person's dignity as something worth protecting, even when nobody was keeping score, and that if Hollow Creek wanted to know what standard Ashcombe Precision was going to be held to going forward, long after Walton Pruitt himself was gone, that was the standard, not a balance sheet, not a shareholder return, but whether the people running it still remembered how to treat a stranger the way Marlene Doyle had treated him. Gus Peavy deserves more of this story than a single sentence about signing over the deed, because without his own particular stubbornness, quiet as it was, none of what Walton eventually built with Marlene and Wren would have had anywhere to land. Gus had bought the whistle stop in 1979 from a widow who could no longer manage it alone, using nearly every dollar he'd saved working the counter himself since he was 17, and he had run it for close to 5 decades with the same unhurried, exacting care he brought to everything else in his life, the kind of care that meant he still, at 71, personally checked the pie case's thermostat every single morning before the first customer walked in, a habit he'd started the week his late wife Dorothy first handed him her mother's pumpkin pie recipe and told him that a pie deserved a cook who took its storage as seriously as its baking. Dorothy had died 6 years before this story turns, and Gus had kept running the diner afterward largely, he admitted to Marlene once, because he did not know what else a man his age was supposed to do with his mornings, and because closing the whistle stop felt, to him, like it would be agreeing that Dorothy's 40 years of working that counter alongside him had simply stopped mattering the moment she was gone. He had fielded over those 6 years no fewer than 4 serious offers from regional restaurant groups eager to buy the building and the name, each offer larger than the last, and had turned every one of them down, sometimes without even naming a real reason, simply saying that the place wasn't for sale to somebody who wanted to gut it and put fryer baskets where the pie case used to sit. When Walton first approached him privately in that first autumn after his revelation to Marlene about purchasing the diner through his holding company, Gus had been, by his own account, deeply suspicious for entirely different reasons than Desmond's later suspicion of Marlene, because Gus alone in Hollow Creek, besides Frank Culpepper, had recognized Walton Pruitt years earlier and had spent a full decade saying absolutely nothing about it to anyone, including Marlene. Out of a philosophy he explained to Walton directly in their very first private conversation about the sale, that he'd watched this particular customer eat alone in booth 9 for 10 years, watched Marlene extend a kindness to him that Gus never once interfered with or commented on because he trusted his own head cook's judgment more than he trusted his own curiosity, and that he was not, at 71 years old, about to let a rich man's guilt money change how carefully he vetted who took over the one thing he'd built with Dorothy across 40 years of marriage. Their negotiation, if it could even be called that, stretched across nearly 4 months, not over price, which Walton had offered fairly and generously from the start, but over structure, because Gus insisted repeatedly that he alone would decide who the diner passed to and under what terms, that Walton's money could buy the building and the land, but could not buy Gus's blessing, and that the blessing was the part that actually mattered to him. Walton, to his considerable credit, according to Gus's own later telling, never once pushed back on this, agreeing readily that Gus should retain full discretion over the successor arrangement, structuring the purchase agreement itself as nothing more than a mechanism that put the choice entirely in Gus's hands rather than a hidden lever Walton could pull later to insert his own preferences. It was Gus, entirely on his own, who decided on joint ownership for Marlene and Wren, rather than sole ownership for either woman, a structure he explained to both of them together, the night he announced it, by saying that he had watched the two of them run that diner as a genuine partnership for 11 years, each of them covering the other's blind spots without needing to be asked, and that splitting them into an owner and an employee now would be, in his words, about the stupidest way imaginable to honor 11 years of exactly the kind of teamwork the place actually ran on. The night Gus formally announced the transfer, gathering the whole staff after closing with a cake Dorothy's recipe box had never actually included, since Gus had to improvise it himself from a box mix and a can of frosting. He gave a short, halting speech that Marlene has never forgotten a word of, though she has never repeated it publicly beyond the version she gave at the reopening. He said that he had spent 48 years worried, in some quiet corner of himself he rarely examined directly, about what would happen to the whistle stop after he was gone, worried it would become exactly the kind of place the restaurant groups kept trying to turn it into, all fryer baskets and corporate signage, and none of the particular, accumulated warmth that Dorothy had built into every corner of it alongside him. And he said that watching Marlene feed a stranger for 10 years without asking anything in return, and watching Wren carry a decade of unspoken checks to the register without ever once asking why, had finally answered a worry he'd been carrying since Dorothy's funeral, because it told him, plainly, that the actual spirit of the place, the thing that made it worth protecting in the first place, had never actually lived in him and Dorothy alone. It had already passed quietly, years before he ever thought to look for it, into exactly the two women standing in front of him that night. And all he was doing, by signing the papers, was making official something that had already become true a long time before any lawyer got involved. Gus stayed on for another 8 months after the transfer, technically retired but unable to fully stay away, coming in most mornings to check the pie case thermostat out of habit long after it had stopped being his responsibility, until Marlene finally, gently, told him that Dorothy's pie case was in excellent hands and that she thought Dorothy would want him to go fishing on a Tuesday morning instead of standing in her kitchen worrying about a thermostat that had not malfunctioned once in 6 years. He took this suggestion badly for about a week and then, according to Wren, showed up one Thursday with an actual fishing rod and a look of profound, slightly embarrassed relief, and began, that same year, spending his mornings at the river instead of the diner, though he never missed a single one of the fund's quarterly public meetings, once Walton's larger plans were underway, sitting quietly in the back row of the hardware store's meeting room, saying nothing, watching Marlene discuss scholarship applications and medical assistance grants with the same unhurried, exacting attention he'd once brought to checking a pie case thermostat every morning for 48 years. Marlene came to know Eleanor Pruitt only through Walton's stories, told slowly across dozens of afternoons in Booth 9 over the 2 years following his revelation, and she would say afterward that she felt she understood Eleanor almost as well as she understood the living people around her, which was its own kind of strange gift Walton gave her without quite meaning to, simply by needing, finally, after 11 years of carrying his wife's memory, mostly alone, someone patient enough to let him tell it in pieces. Eleanor Ashcombe had grown up in Bath County, the daughter of a rural mail carrier and a woman who ran the county's only lending library out of a converted feed store, and she had wanted, from the time she was small, to be a teacher, a plan she pursued without deviation through a state teachers' college and into a first job at the Hollow Creek Elementary School, where she taught 3rd grade for 4 years before she married Walton, and where, by every account Walton ever gave, she had been the kind of teacher former students still mentioned to her decades later at the grocery store, the one who'd noticed something in them nobody else had bothered to notice. She met Walton at a county fair, not at some more fitting society event the Pruitt family might have arranged, a fact Walton told Marlene with evident pride, as though the ordinariness of the meeting were itself a small victory over his own family's expectations. Eleanor had been running a dunking booth for the school's fundraiser, soaked to the skin from her own students' better-than-expected aim, and Walton, 23 years old and newly returned from college to work under his father at the plant, had stood in line 4 separate times just to talk to her between throws, a fact Eleanor apparently reminded him of for the rest of their marriage whenever he needed, in her judgment, to be taken down a peg. They married 2 years later, and Eleanor, Walton told Marlene, had spent the following 39 years doing something he did not fully appreciate until she was gone, functioning as the only person in his entire adult life who treated him exactly the same, whether he'd just closed a record quarter or made a decision that would keep him up at night for years afterward. The only person who never once seemed impressed or intimidated by the size of what he'd built, because she had never, in 39 years, cared very much about the size of it in the first place. It was Eleanor. Walton told Marlene one Thursday afternoon in his 2nd year of these long, unhurried conversations, who had first pushed back hardest against the Hollow Creek plant closure, years before Eleanor's own illness made the argument moot, not because she claimed to understand the financial pressures Walton was navigating. She was the first to admit she didn't, but because she had taught the children of half the families who worked that plant floor and could not, she told him, separate the spreadsheet from the specific faces she pictured every time he described a projected job loss number in the abstract. She had asked him, during the worst of that 4-year fight with his own board, whether he had personally gone and looked any of those workers in the eye and told them himself, rather than letting a severance letter do it for him, and Walton had admitted, to Marlene, that he hadn't, not most of them, that he delegated the hardest conversations to his human resources director, the way executives are trained to do, and that Eleanor's question had haunted him considerably more, in the 2 decades since, than any board meeting or shareholder letter ever had, precisely because he'd never had a good answer for it and had known, even at the time, that the absence of a good answer was itself the answer. Eleanor's illness, when it came, arrived with the particular cruelty of a diagnosis that explained, retroactively, 18 months of vague symptoms both of them had attributed to ordinary aging. Exhaustion Eleanor had chalked up to a demanding schedule of grandchild visits and garden club commitments, a persistent ache she'd mentioned to her doctor twice before anyone thought to look deeper. By the time the specialists in Cleveland confirmed what was wrong, the disease had already progressed well past the window where the more hopeful treatments might have worked, and Eleanor, characteristically, had responded to this news not with despair, but with a kind of brisk, organizing energy that Walton described to Marlene as almost unbearable to witness, because it meant watching his wife spend some of her last clear-headed weeks making lists, arranging her own affairs, writing letters to Callie to be opened at intervals across the coming years, and trying in every way available to her to leave the people she loved as prepared as she could manage for a loss she refused to let anyone pretend wasn't coming. The 14 months of her illness were, by Walton's account, the only period of his adult life in which he stopped entirely being able to compartmentalize the company from the rest of his existence. And he told Marlene that he considered those 14 months, painful as they were, among the most honest of his entire marriage, because for the first time in decades he was simply present, in a hospital room or a hospice bed, with nothing to manage and nothing to decide except how to be useful to one specific, irreplaceable person for as many hours as he had left with her. Desmond, 39 at the time, had stepped in to run daily operations almost entirely on his own during that stretch, a fact Walton credited decades later as the origin of both Desmond's genuine competence as an executive and, perhaps, some of the emotional distance that later calcified between them, because a 39-year-old running a company alone while his mother died does not always have the luxury of processing his own grief in real time. And Walton suspected, looking back, that Desmond had simply never fully gone back and done that processing at all, burying it instead under 2 subsequent decades of increasingly demanding responsibility. The conversation in the hospice room, the one where Eleanor asked Walton to go back to Hollow Creek, happened on a Tuesday, 4 days before she died, and Walton told Marlene the full version of it only once, on an afternoon in his 3rd year of visits to the diner after his revelation, in a voice quieter than she'd ever heard him use, even for the story of the courthouse hearing. Eleanor had been lucid that afternoon, a clarity the hospice nurses had warned him sometimes arrived unexpectedly in the final days as a kind of temporary reprieve, and she had asked him to open the window because she wanted to hear the mockingbirds that nested somewhere near the hospice building's garden every spring. And then she had told him, holding his hand with a grip Walton said still felt stronger than it had any right to be, that she had one request, and that she needed him to actually do it, rather than simply agree to it in the moment, the way he sometimes agreed to things he didn't intend to follow through on. "Go back to Hollow Creek," she said, "not to fix it. You can't fix 20 years with a check, Walton, and I mean that. I don't want you writing checks at that town like you're settling an invoice. I want you to go be a person there. An ordinary, quiet, uncomfortable person in a place you took something important away from, and I want you to let it be uncomfortable, and I want you to stay long enough that the discomfort turns into something else. I don't know what, but something else. Because you have spent your whole life being important in rooms full of important people, and I don't think you have any idea, not really, what it costs a town to lose the thing that made it feel like it mattered. And I think the only way you'll ever understand it is to go sit inside that loss for a while instead of managing it from 2 states away." Walton had asked her, that afternoon, how long was long enough, and Eleanor, with what Walton described to Marlene as the last real flash of her own dry humor, had said, "You'll know it's long enough when you've stopped counting the days, and considerably longer than that besides." She died 4 days later on a Saturday morning, with Walton and Desmond and a 20-year-old Callie all in the room, and Walton told Marlene that the single detail he remembered most clearly from that morning, more than anything said, was that somebody, he never learned who, had left the window cracked exactly the way Eleanor liked it, and that a mockingbird had been singing, faintly, the entire time. Marlene had asked Walton that very first Tuesday of his revelation, why the vegetable soup specifically? Out of everything on a menu that had at least 6 other options he'd been told were quite good, and Walton had not answered her right away that day, saying only that it was a longer story than they had time for in one sitting. And it was not until nearly a year later, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, with the diner mostly empty and the rain coming down steady outside the front windows, that he finally told her the whole answer. One he said he had never told anyone else, not Eleanor, not Desmond, not even Callie. The vegetable soup, he explained, was the last meal his own mother had cooked for the family before she died, when Walton was 11 years old, in the big house on Chandler Hill that had never, in his memory, felt like a particularly warm place to grow up, his father being a serious, exacting man who ran the plant with the same formality he brought to the dinner table, and his mother being, by contrast, the one soft, unguarded presence in that entire house, a woman who had grown up poor 2 counties over and never fully adjusted to a life of household staff and formal dinners, and who used to sneak into the kitchen herself over the cook's mild objections to make a vegetable soup from a recipe her own mother had taught her, using whatever was left in the pantry at the end of the week, a habit Walton's father considered beneath the family's station and tolerated only because he could never quite bring himself to forbid his wife the one thing that seemed to make her happy in that house. She had died suddenly, of a stroke at 41, when Walton was 11, and the vegetable soup she'd made 3 nights before she died, an entirely ordinary meal at the time, had become, in the 50 years since, the single sensory memory Walton could reliably access of what his mother's actual presence had felt like, more vivid to him even than her voice or her face in old photographs, because grief, he told Marlene, does strange, specific things to memory. And sometimes the thing that survives clearest isn't the big moment everyone assumes should matter most. It's a smell or a taste, or the exact way steam rose off a bowl on a particular kind of gray afternoon. He had ordered vegetable soup, without entirely realizing why, at restaurants across 5 decades of business travel, comparing each attempt, unconsciously, against a 50-year-old memory no restaurant had ever come close to matching, until the Whistle Stop's version, made from a recipe Marlene had inherited from the diner's previous cook and adjusted slightly over the years, according to her own instincts, happened. By pure coincidence, neither of them could ever fully explain. To use almost exactly the same combination of time and a particular sweetness from cooking the carrots down longer than most recipes called for. A coincidence that had struck Walton the very first time he tasted it a decade earlier, with a force he described to Marlene as almost physically staggering, sitting alone in a diner booth on a rainy afternoon tasting, for the first time in nearly 50 years, something that reminded him, however imperfectly, of his mother's kitchen. "That's why I kept coming back," he told her. "Not just for the company, though God knows I needed that too by then. I kept coming back because your soup was the closest I'd gotten in half a century to a version of comfort I'd almost convinced myself I only imagined." Marlene, hearing this, had gone quiet herself for a long moment and had told him only that she wished she'd known that 10 years earlier, and Walton had said that was exactly why he hadn't told her, because some things, held quietly and privately for long enough, become more true to you than they would if you said them out loud too early, and he had needed, he thought, the full 10 years to be sure the soup itself hadn't become the whole reason, that the woman making it had become at least as important as the memory it summoned, before he trusted himself to say any of it. The second year of the fund's operation, Marlene's 3rd year as a board member, brought its own set of complications that tested, in smaller ways, the same instincts Walton had first recognized in her a decade of Tuesdays and Thursdays before any of the board meetings existed. An applicant came before the fund's board that spring, a young man named Dalton Reese, 22 years old, requesting assistance covering a semester of technical college tuition after losing a partial scholarship due to a mid-semester medical leave, and the board's initial instinct was to deny the request on a technicality, since the guidelines, as originally written, specified assistance for students in good academic standing. and Dalton's leave of absence had technically placed him outside that standing. Marlene argued that a fund built to reflect the instinct that had originally impressed Walton, noticing a person struggling and doing something about it without making them prove they deserved it first, could not in good conscience deny a young man assistance specifically because he'd gotten sick, and the board, after debate, agreed to amend the guidelines that same meeting to account for medical hardship rather than penalize it. A small change Marlene considered one of the more meaningful things she'd contributed to the fund, because it meant the fund would go on making that same distinction long after she and Walton were no longer the ones sitting at that table. Walton attended fewer and fewer of the fund's meetings himself as that second year wore on, not out of disinterest, but because his doctor's cautious language about his heart had by then become considerably less cautious, and he had begun spending more of his remaining energy on the diner and on Callie and on Desmond, whose relationship with his father had slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely warmed over those 2 years into something neither man would have predicted during the worst of the courthouse fight. Desmond began visiting Hollow Creek himself that second year, quietly without press attention, staying at his father's rental house on Chandler Hill Road rather than a hotel, and Marlene noticed, the few times their visits overlapped at the diner, that Desmond had started ordering the vegetable soup himself without ever explaining why, and she suspected, though she never asked directly, that his father had finally told him the same 50-year-old story about his grandmother's kitchen that he'd once told Marlene alone in a rain-soaked booth, and that some part of Desmond had wanted, quietly, to taste whatever piece of his own family history. His father had spent a decade quietly rediscovering 3 afternoons a week in a diner 200 miles from Charlotte. Walton Pruitt died in the spring of the 3rd year after he first told Marlene who he was, at home in the modest rental house on Chandler Hill Road rather than in a hospital, a choice he had been explicit and firm about with his doctors months earlier, saying only that he had already spent 14 months of his life watching someone he loved die in a series of clinical rooms, and that he intended, when his own turn came, to die somewhere that still smelled like a house rather than a hallway. He had grown steadily weaker across that final winter, the arrhythmia from 2 years earlier having given way to a broader, more general failing that his doctor described to the family, gently, as simply the ordinary conclusion of an 80-year-old heart that had done a great deal of work over a great many years, and Callie had moved into the Chandler Hill house that February, taking an extended leave from her physical therapy practice in Charlotte, and Desmond had begun flying up nearly every weekend, and Marlene, at Walton's own quiet request, delivered by Callie, had started bringing him a small thermos of the diner's vegetable soup twice a week, since he could no longer manage the drive himself, a role reversal that Marlene found more difficult to sit with than almost anything else in the entire 3 years. Standing in the doorway of a dying man's bedroom holding a thermos of the same soup he'd once eaten from a booth, she'd never imagined he'd stop being able to reach on his own. He was lucid nearly to the end, a mercy Callie and Marlene both mentioned to each other afterward more than once, and he spent much of his final month doing something Marlene recognized immediately from the shape of it, because it was, in its way, the same thing he had done across a decade of Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday afternoons in Booth 9, quietly, deliberately paying attention to the people in front of him, one at a time, with nothing left to manage and nothing left to prove. He had a long conversation with Desmond, the specifics of which neither man ever fully shared with anyone outside the family, though Desmond told Marlene afterward only that his father had told him, plainly, that he was proud of him. Not despite the hard decisions Desmond had made running the company for over a decade, but including them, because a company that size did not run itself on sentiment alone, and Desmond had needed, Walton said, to be the version of himself he'd become in order for there to be a company left at all for Walton's own late-life reckoning to matter to anyone, and that he wanted Desmond to stop, finally, treating his own competence as something to apologize for. He had a separate, longer conversation with Callie, in which he told her, among other things, that he wanted her to keep her seat on the Hollow Creek Community Fund's board for as long as she was willing to make the drive, Not because the family needed a Pruitt watching over it, he was explicit that they didn't, but because he thought she had inherited more of Eleanor's particular instinct for actually looking at people than anyone else left in the family, and that instinct, he told her, was worth more to that fund over the coming decades than any amount of money he could leave it. He asked to see Marlene alone, on a Tuesday 3 days before he died, and Marlene drove to Chandler Hill Road in the early afternoon, the same hour she would have found him in Booth 9 a few years earlier, and sat beside his bed in a house that had grown quiet with the particular stillness of a home preparing itself for a loss everyone inside it already knew was coming. He was thin by then, his voice reduced to something barely above a whisper, but his eyes, Marlene said afterward, had lost none of the steadiness she remembered from that first Tuesday he'd asked whether she had a few minutes to sit with an old man. He told her that he had gone over many times in recent weeks every version of what he might have done differently across his whole life. The plant closure, the years of distance from Desmond, the decades he might have spent going back to Hollow Creek sooner instead of waiting for Eleanor's illness to force the reckoning, and that he had made his peace, mostly with all of it, except for one thing he wanted to say to her directly while he still could. "I want you to know," he said, "that I have thought more than once about what would have happened if I had simply told you who I was the first year instead of waiting 10, and I've decided finally that I'm grateful I didn't. Not because the wait was pleasant, some of those years were lonelier than I ever let on, but because if I had told you immediately, some part of both of us would always have wondered whether your kindness was really yours, freely given, or whether it was something you'd have felt obligated to perform for a rich man in a diner booth. 10 years gave us the only kind of proof that actually means anything, the kind neither of us could have manufactured on purpose even if we'd tried," Marlene had told him, holding his hand the way she'd once held it in a Lexington hospital hallway, that she did not think of the last 3 years as some kind of reward for the 10 before them, that she had never once, across the whole decade, been waiting for anything, and Walton had said, "Yes, I know, that's exactly why it mattered. We've had this conversation before," and smiled, and Marlene had laughed despite herself, through tears. Because it was true, they had had almost this exact exchange before, on the very first Tuesday, and something about hearing it again at the very end felt less like repetition and more like a kind of closing of a circle neither of them had set out to draw. He died on a Friday morning, quietly, with Callie and Desmond both in the house, and Marlene learned of it that afternoon in a phone call from Callie that she took standing at the diner's pass-through window, and she closed the kitchen early that day for the first time in 16 years of running it, not because Gus or anyone else asked her to, but because she found, standing there with the phone still in her hand, that she could not imagine cooking anything at all that afternoon, and Wren, without needing to be told why, simply flipped the sign in the front window to closed and locked the door behind the last customer without a word of explanation to anyone. The funeral, held the following week at the same Baptist church whose mornings Eleanor had once played piano for as a young bride decades earlier, was smaller and plainer than most people in the county expected from a man whose name had once appeared on lists of the wealthiest people in the state. Held at Walton's own explicit written instruction that there be no elaborate memorial, no company-wide announcement beyond a simple notice, and no press invited, though the Louisville paper ran a respectful, accurate obituary anyway that mentioned, in its final paragraph, the diner cook who had fed him for a decade without knowing his name and the manufacturing facility that now bore his late wife's name, a detail the reporter had specifically asked Marlene's permission to include, and that Marlene had granted, on the condition that the story be about Eleanor's name on that building and not about her own role in any of it. Frank Culpepper attended, sitting near the back in the same flannel shirt he wore to the diner every morning, and told Marlene afterward, briefly, that he'd come to pay respects to a man who'd finally sat down and had the conversation Frank had been quietly waiting a decade for, and that whatever else was true about the 22 years before that conversation happened, he did not think it was nothing. A man spending the last chapter of his life trying, however imperfectly, to make something right, and Marlene had thought, hearing that it was about as close to full forgiveness as Frank Culpepper was ever going to offer, and that it was, given everything, more than enough. Walton's will, read the following month in a plain conference room at his Lexington attorney's office, rather than anywhere more imposing, confirmed everything he had told Marlene and Wren and the fund's board over the preceding 3 years, structured exactly as he had described it from the very beginning, with almost nothing left to surprise anyone in the room, which Marlene understood, sitting through the reading, was itself precisely the point that Walton had wanted his final wishes to feel like the natural conclusion of 3 years of open conversation, rather than a dramatic revelation sprung on a grieving family, because he had, by his own account, already lived through one version of a family fractured by unexpected financial shocks and had no intention of leaving that same fracture behind him twice. The Whistle Stop Diner's ownership structure, already transferred jointly to Marlene and Wren 2 years earlier, remained untouched by the will beyond a small additional sum earmarked specifically for the building's long-term maintenance, ensuring neither woman would ever face a costly roof repair or foundation problem that threatened the business itself. Ashcombe Precision continued under its existing independent management and covenant structure exactly as designed, with Desmond, at his own request, and to the board's genuine relief, declining any formal role in its operation or governance, saying only that he thought his father had been right to insist it exist entirely outside the family's reach, a sentiment that would have surprised the Desmond of 3 years earlier considerably. The Hollow Creek Community Fund received a substantially larger endowment than its initial $2 million, an amount that would eventually place its permanent, professionally invested principal near $30 million once the full estate settlement concluded, a sum Marlene found genuinely difficult to hold in her mind in any concrete way, even sitting in the room where the number was first read aloud. And the will specified, in language Walton's attorney read slowly and carefully, that the fund's board composition should always include, for as long as the diner itself continued operating under any form, whoever held primary ownership of the Whistle Stop, a provision that effectively guaranteed Marlene, and eventually whoever succeeded her at the diner decades into the future, a permanent voice in how that money reached the town, an arrangement Walton's attorney explained had been his own suggestion originally, a way of tying the fund's governance forever to the exact instinct that had inspired it in the first place, rather than letting it drift, over subsequent decades, into the hands of professional administrators who had never once stood behind a diner counter, deciding whether a stranger's dignity was worth $6 of unpaid soup. Desmond and Callie both received substantial personal inheritances, structured, notably, almost identically to each other, rather than favoring Desmond as the elder heir and only child of Walton's own generation, a choice Desmond told Marlene months later he had initially found surprising and eventually found he entirely agreed with, since Callie's steady, unglamorous work as a physical therapist and her quiet, consistent presence in her grandfather's final years had, in Desmond's own reassessment of the family he'd grown up in, mattered considerably more than the traditional weight of primogeniture the Pruitt family had operated under for 3 prior generations. Desmond retained control of Pruitt Industrial Group itself, the parent company built from the original cordage and steel business and diversified over decades into a dozen other markets, with a personal note from his father read into the record at his own request, thanking Desmond for 3 decades of running a company that had, whatever its founders' late-life regrets about one specific decision, employed tens of thousands of people across its history and put a great many children through college who otherwise wouldn't have gone, and telling him, in the will's own plain language, that Walton considered Desmond's stewardship of that legacy, warts and all, the second proudest achievement of his life, after 39 years married to Eleanor Ashcombe. The following 2 years brought the kind of quiet, unremarkable growth that Marlene had come to understand was the actual measure of whether any of this had meant what Walton hoped it would mean, growth too gradual and unglamorous to make headlines, but substantial enough to genuinely reshape Hollow Creek's future. Ashcombe Precision's workforce grew past 280 employees by its second full year of operation, on track toward the 300 to 400 Walton's original projections had targeted, and among the new hires that second year was Terrence, the same line cook who had once carried Patsy Lund's complaint back to Marlene's kitchen, who left the diner for a better-paying position on the facility's production floor, with Marlene's genuine, unreserved blessing telling her on his last shift that he hoped someday to be exactly the kind of long-tenured employee whose loyalty a place like Ashcombe Precision was specifically designed to reward rather than exploit. The Hollow Creek Community Funds Board, now including Callie as its sixth permanent member and meeting quarterly in a modest room above the town's hardware store, had by that second year funded 11 community college scholarships, 4 small business loans, and an emergency medical assistance program that had already, in its short existence, kept 2 separate families from medical bankruptcy after unexpected diagnoses. Decisions Marlene still found herself nervous discussing at every single meeting, a nervousness she had come to recognize not as inadequacy, but as the correct, healthy weight such decisions ought to carry for anyone taking them seriously. Patsy Lund, whose early resentment about the diner's ownership transfer had softened considerably over the intervening years, particularly once the profit-sharing structure began paying out real, meaningful annual bonuses tied to the diner's own improving margins, became, somewhat to Marlene's surprise and considerable delight, one of the loudest advocates in town for the fund's continued transparency, standing up at a town hall meeting the fund's board held that second year to explain publicly, for the first time, exactly how the money was allocated and decided, and telling the assembled crowd without any prompting from Marlene that she'd been skeptical herself once of 2 women inheriting a diner while everyone else got a pat on the back, and that watching how it had actually played out over 2 years had taught her something about the difference between an unfair windfall and a genuine, deliberate attempt to spread a good fortune as widely and as thoughtfully as one town could manage to spread it. Abby Doyle turned 16, the spring Ashcombe. Precision's workforce crossed 280 employees and had grown over those years into exactly the kind of sharp, watchful young woman her early questions about wealth and motive had suggested she might become, though what she'd grown into surprised even Marlene a little, a girl who had started volunteering. Without being asked, at the Hollow Creek Community Fund's quarterly application review sessions, reading through hardship applications alongside the adult board members and asking more than once the exact kind of uncomfortable, clarifying question her mother had once asked about Dalton Reese's tuition assistance, questions about whether a guideline written to prevent fraud might be accidentally punishing exactly the people the fund existed to help. Marlene watched her daughter develop this instinct with a pride she found difficult to fully articulate, even to Cole, because it felt, watching Abby lean over an application at that hardware store conference table, like watching something her own mother had planted decades earlier in a kitchen, 2 towns over, finally bloom in a 3rd generation that had never known hunger, the way her grandmother's generation had. And Marlene understood, watching it happen, that this, more than the diner or the fund or the factory, might be the truest and most durable part of everything. Walton Pruitt's decade of quiet Booth 9 afternoons had ultimately set in motion. There is a plaque near Booth 9 at the Whistle Stop Diner today, the one Wren insisted on adding over Walton's own mild objection while he was still alive, and it reads simply, "In memory of nothing lost that kindness couldn't hold," with no name on it at all. And Marlene still finds, on quiet afternoons when the lunch rush has cleared and the light comes golden low through the front windows the way it always has, that customers new to town will occasionally ask her what the plaque means, expecting, she thinks, some tidy explanation they can repeat to their own children as a fable with a clean moral at the end. She has learned over the years since Walton died to give them a shorter answer than the whole 10 years actually deserves, something like, "There was a quiet man who used to sit right there," and somebody was kind to him before either of them knew why it would matter, and most people nod and go back to their coffee. And a few, the ones with a particular look in their eye, ask a follow-up question, and those are the ones Marlene sits down with, if the kitchen allows it, and tells the longer version to, because she has come to believe, across everything that happened, that the story only does any good in the world if it gets told slowly enough that people actually absorb the uncomfortable middle part, the part where she didn't know, the part where knowing would have ruined it. Booth 9 itself still gets used by regular customers most days, and Marlene made a point early on of never treating it as some kind of shrine that ordinary paying customers couldn't sit in, because she believes, and believed Walton would have agreed completely, that turning his booth into a museum piece would have been exactly the kind of hollow, performative gesture he spent the last 3 years of his life trying to move past. But there is one afternoon a year, the second Tuesday of July, the anniversary of the day he first told her who he really was, when Marlene quietly reserves booth 9 from 2 until 4 in the afternoon, tells whoever's working the floor not to seat anyone there, and makes a bowl of vegetable soup and a side of cornbread that nobody eats, and sits across from the empty booth herself for a few minutes before going back to the kitchen, a small private ritual she has never fully explained to anyone, including Cole, though she suspects he understands it better than he lets on, the same way he understood 16 years into their marriage, exactly what to say the night she first told him who the quiet man in booth 9 had turned out to be. Callie still drives up from Charlotte for the fund's quarterly meetings, 4 years running now, and has become, in her grandfather's absence, something closer to a genuine friend of the Doyle family than merely a connection to a complicated inheritance, spending Thanksgiving with them twice since Walton died, an arrangement that began, the first year, almost accidentally, when Callie mentioned during a fund meeting that she didn't have particular plans, and Sam, who was 11 that year and had never fully stopped thinking of Callie as an extension of the grandfather he still talked about more than his parents realized, simply asked her, in front of everyone, whether she wanted to come eat turkey with them, and Callie had said yes before anyone could second-guess whether it was appropriate, and it had become, by the second year, simply what they did, no longer requiring an invitation at all. Desmond visits Hollow Creek himself twice a year now, staying a few nights each time in the Chandler Hill house he ultimately decided to keep rather than sell, and he still, without fail, orders the vegetable soup, and Marlene still, without fail, serves it to him herself, rather than sending it out with whoever's on the floor, a small unspoken ritual neither of them has ever needed to discuss out loud. Ashcombe Precision employed just over 310 people by its 4th full year of operation, reaching, slightly ahead of schedule, the upper end of the projections Walton's investment team had originally modeled, and the facility's current general manager, a woman named Priscilla Odom hired from outside the family, entirely exactly as Walton insisted, keeps a framed photograph in her office, not of Walton himself, but of the plaque from Booth 9, a gift from Marlene, the week Priscilla started, with a small handwritten note taped to the back that simply says, "This is the actual standard, not the balance sheet." A gesture Priscilla has told Marlene more than once she thinks about every single quarter when the board pushes for numbers that would require cutting corners the facility's founding covenants were specifically designed to prevent. The Hollow Creek Community Fund crossed its 5th year of operation, having funded 31 scholarships, 9 small business loans, and a medical assistance program that has, by that point, helped 11 separate families avoid the kind of medical debt that used to quietly bankrupt 1 or 2 Hollow Creek households every single year before the fund existed, numbers Marlene now recites easily in board meetings, though she still, when asked to speak about the fund publicly, finds herself returning to the same simple frame Walton offered her that very first Tuesday, that none of this was ever supposed to be about a reward for kindness. It was supposed to be about proving that kindness offered without any expectation of reward could still, occasionally, in ways nobody could have planned or guaranteed, ripple outward into something that outlasted the person who first offered it. Marlene thinks often, still, about the version of herself who stood behind that register for 10 years, doing quiet math against a grocery bill or a car repair, wondering some weeks whether she could really afford to keep absorbing a stranger's tab into her own tip money, never once imagining that anyone was watching, let alone measuring, let alone that the outcome of that private, unwitnessed decision would eventually reach a factory floor and a scholarship fund and a granddaughter's Thanksgiving table 200 miles from where it started. She does not believe, and has said as much publicly more than once, when reporters occasionally still ask her to reflect on the whole decade for some anniversary story or another, that everyone who is kind to a stranger gets a factory and a fund and a fortune out of it, and she thinks it would be a genuinely dangerous lesson to teach her own children or anyone else's that kindness is a kind of investment strategy, a lottery ticket you buy by being decent to the right stranger at the right moment. What she believes instead, and what she tries to say clearly every time someone asks, is something closer to what Walton told her that very first Tuesday in Booth 9, that the 10 years before she knew anything were the entire point, not a delay before the real story started, and that the only version of this that means anything is the version where you decide, over and over, in small, unwitnessed moments at a register or a counter or a kitchen table, who you are going to be when nobody is keeping score, understanding fully that most of the time, nobody actually is keeping score, and that the deciding has to happen anyway, has to happen first and completely apart from any hope of the rare. Extraordinary exception where the universe, once in a great while, turns out to have been watching after all. There was a young couple who came into the whistle stop just last month, new to town. The husband recently hired on at Ashcombe Precision, the wife 8 months pregnant and moving slowly between the door and the booth, and when they came up short at the register by $4 and change, genuinely short, fumbling through a thin wallet with the same small, practiced embarrassment Marlene remembered from 100 afternoons with a different quiet man in a different gray jacket. She did not hesitate for even half a second before telling them not to worry about it. They'd square up next time, and she watched the husband's shoulders come down from around his ears the particular way shoulders do when shame gets lifted unexpectedly, and his wife looked at Marlene with an expression Marlene recognized immediately, because she suspects she has worn that exact expression herself, more than once, on harder weeks than she likes to admit even now. She does not know, and has said she does not particularly care to know, whether that young man will ever amount to anything the world would consider remarkable, whether there is any hidden fortune or hidden history behind him worth discovering 10 years from now. She understood, watching him walk out with his sandwich and his $4 still owed to her tip jar, that the entire lesson of the last decade was never actually about Walton Pruitt specifically. It was about the plain, durable fact that you get to decide, every single day in moments nobody else is watching closely enough to remember who you are going to be, and that once in a very great while, so rarely that nobody should ever count on it or wait around for it, the deciding turns out to matter more than you could possibly have imagined at the time. But the deciding has to come first, entirely on its own terms, with no hope of the extraordinary exception attached to it, or none of what follows means what it is supposed to mean. That is the only version of this story Marlene Doyle has ever wanted her own children, or anyone else's children, to remember, long after they have forgotten every other detail of what happened to a diner cook in a small Kentucky town the year a silent old man in the back booth finally told her the truth. If this story moved you even a little, if you believe, the way Marlene believes, that kindness offered without the hope of a reward is still worth offering, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because we bring you a new true story just like this one every single day. Stories about ordinary people whose quiet decisions turned out to matter more than they ever expected. Leave a comment and tell us what you would have done in Booth 9, and let us know which part of Marlene and Walton's story stayed with you the longest. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and we will see you in the next story.